The emergence of what would later be termed the Silk Road began not as a grand design for international commerce, but as a consequence of Han Dynasty China's military and diplomatic ambitions during the 2nd century BC. Emperor Wu of Han, ascending to the throne in 141 BC, inherited a dynasty already stretched by conflicts with the nomadic Xiongnu Confederation along China's northern borders. These fierce horsemen had repeatedly raided Chinese settlements, disrupting agriculture and threatening the stability of frontier regions. The emperor's solution would inadvertently create the most significant trade network in ancient history. The Han court's initial westward focus stemmed from intelligence reports about potential allies beyond the Xiongnu territories. Chinese officials had learned of the Yuezhi people, who had been driven from their homeland in the Gansu corridor by Xiongnu attacks around 174 BC. These displaced nomads had reportedly settled somewhere in the distant west, and Emperor Wu conceived a strategic alliance that would allow China to attack the Xiongnu from two fronts simultaneously. This military calculus led to one of history's most consequential diplomatic missions. Zhang Qian, a palace attendant with demonstrated loyalty and organizational skills, received the dangerous assignment of locating and negotiating with the Yuezhi in 138 BC. His expedition force numbered approximately 100 men, including his Xiongnu guide Ganfu, who possessed crucial knowledge of the Western territories. The mission immediately encountered catastrophe when Xiongnu forces captured the entire party shortly after crossing into nomadic territory. Rather than executing their prisoners, the Xiongnu held Zhang Qian and his men in comfortable captivity for over a decade, hoping to extract information about Chinese military capabilities and frontier defences. During his captivity, Zhang Qian observed Xiongnu society firsthand, noting their sophisticated horse-breeding techniques, mobile warfare tactics, and extensive knowledge of Central Asian geography. The Xiongnu maintained trade relationships with various oasis settlements, exchanging livestock, leather goods, and metal weapons for agricultural products and luxury items. This exposure provided Zhang Qian with invaluable intelligence about the complex web of relationships linking nomadic and sedentary populations across the steppes and desert regions. Zhang Qian's escape around 129 BC marked the beginning of his actual diplomatic mission. Travelling with a reduced party of survivors, he navigated treacherous mountain passes and desert routes to reach Bactria, where he discovered that the Yuezhi had indeed established a new kingdom. However, the diplomatic reality proved disappointing for Chinese strategic objectives. The Yuezhi, now settled in fertile valleys with access to established trade routes, showed no interest in mounting costly military campaigns against their former Xiongnu enemies. They had adapted successfully to their new environment and viewed the distant conflict as irrelevant to their current prosperity. Despite the diplomatic failure, Zhang Qian's observations of Bactrian markets revealed extraordinary commercial possibilities. He encountered Chinese silk products that had somehow reached these western regions through intermediary merchants, commanding prices far exceeding their original cost. Local rulers and wealthy merchants displayed silk garments as symbols of prestige, while Chinese lacquerware and bronze mirrors appeared in elite households. These goods had travelled through multiple hands across thousands of miles, with each transaction adding significant markup to their final value. The return journey in 126 BC proved equally hazardous, with Xiongnu forces again capturing Zhang Qian's party. His second escape occurred during a period of internal Xiongnu political turmoil, allowing the survivors to reach Chinese territory after 13 years of absence. Zhang Qian's detailed reports to Emperor Wu described not only the political landscape of Central Asia, but also the economic potential of systematic trade relationships with Western regions. Emperor Wu's response demonstrated the Han dynasty's growing commercial sophistication. Rather than abandoning Western engagement after the diplomatic setback, the the court authorized Zhang Qian's second expedition in 115 BC with explicitly commercial objectives. This mission carried substantial quantities of Chinese silk, lacquerware and metalwork as trade goods rather than diplomatic gifts. The expedition also included technical specialists who could assess the quality of foreign products and identify potentially profitable import opportunities. Zhang Qian's second journey established direct contact with numerous Central Asian polities, including the kingdoms of Fergana, Sogdiana and Parthia. Each region offered distinct products and commercial opportunities. Fergana bred exceptional horses that Chinese military commanders coveted for cavalry units. Sogdian merchants demonstrated remarkable skill in long-distance trade organisation, maintaining networks that connected Indian, Persian and Mediterranean markets. Parthian territories provided access to luxury goods from the Roman Empire, including glassware, precious stones and exotic spices. The Han Court's systematic approach to Western trade development involved establishing official markets in frontier cities where foreign merchants could exchange goods under Chinese supervision. These controlled trading posts allowed imperial officials to collect customs duties while monitoring the flow of strategic materials. Chinese silk production, concentrated in the Yangtze River Valley and surrounding regions, could now reach Western markets through organized channels rather than random intermediary transactions. Silk manufacturing represented one of China's most closely guarded technological secrets. The complex process of silkworm cultivation, cocoon harvesting, and thread production required specialized knowledge passed down through generations of artisan families. Chinese authorities imposed severe penalties on anyone attempting to export silkworms or reveal production techniques to foreigners. This monopoly ensured that all silk reaching Western markets originated from Chinese sources, creating a dependable revenue stream for the imperial treasury. The formation of regular trade networks connecting Chinese production centres with Western markets required solving numerous logistical challenges. Merchants needed reliable information about route conditions, seasonal weather patterns, and political stability in transit regions. The Han government began maintaining diplomatic relationships with various Central Asian rulers, specifically to ensure safe passage for Chinese trading expeditions. These arrangements often involved annual tribute payments or gift exchanges that guaranteed protection for merchant caravans. Parthian merchants emerged as crucial intermediaries in the developing trade system. The Parthian Empire, stretching from the Euphrates River to eastern Iran, controlled key segments of the routes connecting Central Asia with Mediterranean markets. Parthian traders possessed extensive knowledge of Roman commercial preferences and could advise Chinese merchants about product modifications that would increase sales in Western markets. They also provided access to Roman silver coins, which became the preferred medium of exchange for high-value transactions across the trade network. Roman demand for Chinese silk grew steadily throughout the 1st century BC, driven by fashion trends among wealthy urban populations. Roman writers described silk as a luxury item that demonstrated the wearer's sophisticated taste and economic status. The fabric's lightweight and lustrous appearance made it particularly popular for women's clothing, while its rarity ensured continued high prices in Roman markets. This sustained demand created predictable profit opportunities for merchants willing to invest in long-distance silk transportation. The Tarim Basin emerged as the crucial geographical nexus for east-west trade during this foundational period. This vast depression, surrounded by some of the world's highest mountain ranges, contained a series of oasis cities that provided essential services for long-distance travellers. These settlements had developed around natural water sources fed by snowmelt from surrounding peaks, creating islands of fertility in otherwise harsh desert terrain. Kashgar, positioned at the western edge of the Tarim Basin, became the primary entry point for goods moving between Chinese territories and Central Asian markets. The city's location at the convergence of several mountain passes made it a natural gathering point for merchant caravans heading in multiple directions. Local rulers recognized the economic potential of their strategic position and invested in infrastructure improvements that attracted increased commercial traffic. Kashgar's markets featured specialized sections for different categories of goods, with silk merchants occupying the most prestigious locations near the city centre. Khotan, located along the southern rim of the Tarim Basin, developed particular expertise in jade processing and luxury textile production. The region's jade deposits had been exploited for centuries, but growing Chinese demand for high-quality jade objects created new commercial opportunities. Khotan's craftsmen developed sophisticated techniques for carving jade into decorative items specifically designed for Chinese markets. The city also became a secondary silk production centre, though using different techniques from Chinese methods and producing fabrics with distinct characteristics. Turpan, situated in a depression below sea level, offered unique advantages for long-distance travellers despite its extreme climate. The city's position provided access to reliable water sources and agricultural products, while its location allowed merchants to avoid some of the most difficult mountain crossings. Turpan's residents developed specialized knowledge of desert survival techniques, offering guide services and equipment that proved essential for crossing the Taklamakan Desert. The Taklamakan Desert presented the most formidable obstacle for east-west trade routes. This vast expanse of shifting sand dunes, with summer temperatures exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit and winter conditions dropping well below freezing, had claimed countless lives over the centuries. Successful desert crossing required careful timing, adequate water supplies, and experienced guides familiar with seasonal weather patterns. Merchants learned to travel during spring and autumn months, when temperatures remained manageable and sandstorms occurred less frequently. Navigation across the Taklamakan relied on a combination of celestial observation, landmark recognition, and local knowledge passed down through generations of desert travellers. Experienced guides could identify subtle terrain features invisible to untrained observers while understanding wind patterns that affected sand dune formation. The desert's southern and northern routes offered different advantages depending on seasonal conditions and political circumstances in various oasis cities. Water management represented the most critical survival skill for desert travellers. Caravans carried water in specially designed leather containers that minimized evaporation while remaining portable across long distances. Merchants learned to identify underground water sources and develop techniques for locating hidden springs that could replenish their supplies. The spacing between reliable water sources determined the maximum distance caravans could travel between oasis stops. The Pamir Mountains, known to ancient travellers as the roof of the world, presented equally challenging obstacles for trade route development. These towering peaks, with many summits exceeding 20,000 feet in elevation, created a formidable barrier between Central Asian steppes and the Indian subcontinent. Mountain passes remained closed by snow for much of the year, forcing merchants to time their crossings carefully to avoid being trapped by sudden weather changes. High-altitude travel required specialized equipment and techniques unknown to merchants accustomed to desert or steppe conditions. The thin air at extreme elevations caused altitude sickness in both humans and animals, while sudden temperature drops could prove fatal to inadequately prepared travelers. Merchants learned to acclimatize gradually to increasing elevations and develop techniques for recognizing dangerous weather conditions that could trap caravans in exposed mountain positions. Yak herds provided essential transportation services in high mountain regions where horses and camels could not function effectively. These hardy animals, adapted to extreme cold and high-altitude conditions, could carry substantial loads across terrain impassable to other domesticated animals. Local populations in mountain regions developed specialized knowledge of yak handling and route finding that proved invaluable to long-distance merchants. The development of reliable route information became crucial for expanding trade networks during this period. Successful merchants maintained detailed records of travel times, seasonal conditions, and local political situations that affected route safety. This information represented valuable commercial intelligence that experienced traders guarded carefully while sometimes sharing with trusted partners or selling to newcomers entering the trade. Political relationships with local rulers along trade routes required constant attention and negotiation. Each oasis city or mountain kingdom maintained its own customs regulations, taxation systems, and security arrangements. Merchants needed to understand local political dynamics and maintain good relationships with authorities who could either facilitate or obstruct commercial activities. These relationships often involved regular gift exchanges, tribute payments, or other forms of diplomatic courtesy that added to the overall cost of long-distance trade. The commercial networks established during Zhang Tian's expeditions transformed dramatically during the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, evolving from sporadic diplomatic exchanges into systematic trade relationships that connected the Roman Empire directly with Han China. This transformation occurred as both empires reached unprecedented levels of prosperity and territorial control, creating the economic conditions necessary for sustained long-distance commerce despite the formidable geographical barriers separating East and West. Roman fascination with Chinese silk intensified considerably during the reign of Augustus, as the empire's expanding wealth created new markets for luxury goods among the senatorial class and wealthy merchants. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii reveals silk fragments in elite households, while contemporary Roman writers began documenting the social implications of silk consumption with increasing frequency. Pliny the Elder complained that Roman gold flowed eastward to pay for silk, estimating that the empire spent 50 million sestertii annually on silk imports alone. This figure, representing roughly 1% of the imperial treasury's annual revenue, demonstrates the extraordinary scale of Roman silk demand during the early imperial period. The Roman preference for silk stemmed from multiple factors beyond mere fashion considerations. The fabric's exceptional lightness made it ideal for the Mediterranean climate, while its lustrous appearance complemented Roman aesthetic preferences for materials that displayed wealth through subtle elegance rather than ostentatious display. Roman women particularly favoured silk for its draping qualities, which enhanced the flowing lines of traditional Roman garments. The fabric's rarity also served important social functions, allowing wealthy families to demonstrate their economic status through clothing choices that clearly distinguished them from lower social classes. Roman merchants developed sophisticated techniques for marketing Chinese silk to maximize profits within the empire's established commercial networks. They discovered that Roman consumers preferred silk dyed in specific colours, particularly deep purples and rich reds that complemented Roman colour symbolism. This market intelligence travelled back along trade routes, influencing Chinese production decisions and creating the first examples of international market adaptation in silk manufacturing. Chinese artisans began producing silk specifically for Roman tastes, using dyeing techniques that created colours unavailable in domestic Chinese markets. The Parthian Empire's strategic position between Roman and Chinese territories allowed Parthian merchants to establish themselves as indispensable intermediaries in the silk trade. Parthian traders maintained permanent representatives in both Roman Syria and Chinese frontier cities, creating communication networks that transmitted market information across thousands of miles. These merchant families developed expertise in currency exchange, language interpretation, and diplomatic protocols that proved essential for facilitating transactions between parties who rarely met face-to-face. Parthian control over Western trade route segments enabled them to implement sophisticated pricing strategies that maximized their profits, while maintaining sufficient price predictability to encourage continued Roman investment in silk purchases. They established standardized markup rates for different categories of goods, with silk commanding the highest premiums due to its exceptional demand in Roman markets. Parthian merchants also developed quality grading systems that allowed Roman buyers to specify desired silk characteristics without physically examining the goods before purchase. The Parthian taxation system along trade routes created both obstacles and opportunities for long-distance commerce. Parthian authorities collected custom duties at multiple points along major trade routes, but they also provided security services and maintained infrastructure that reduced overall transportation costs. Parthian investment in road construction, bridge maintenance, and way station development created more reliable travel conditions that reduced the risks associated with long-distance commerce. These improvements allowed merchant caravans to travel faster and carry larger loads, partially offsetting the impact of taxation on final prices. Parthian diplomatic relationships with various Central Asian kingdoms proved crucial for maintaining stable trade conditions during periods of political instability. When local conflicts disrupted specific route segments, Parthian officials could negotiate alternative arrangements or provide military escorts for merchant caravans. These services commanded premium fees, but they ensured that trade could continue even during periods of regional warfare or political upheaval. The rise of the Sassanid Empire in 224 AD initially disrupted established trade patterns as new rulers implemented different policies toward long-distance commerce. However, the Sassanids quickly recognized the revenue potential of silk trade taxation and developed even more systematic approaches to managing trans-Asian commerce. Sassanid officials created standardized documentation requirements for merchant caravans, established fixed fee schedules for various services, and implemented quality control measures that reduced disputes between buyers and sellers. Sassanid investment in trade infrastructure exceeded Parthian efforts in both scale and sophistication. The new empire constructed caravanserais at regular intervals along major routes, providing standardized accommodations and services for traveling merchants. These facilities included secure storage areas for valuable goods, maintenance services for pack animals, and meeting spaces where merchants could negotiate transactions with local representatives. The caravanserais also served as information centres, where travellers could obtain current intelligence about route conditions, political developments, and market opportunities in distant cities. The development of standardized weights and measures across different regions represented one of the most significant achievements of the classical period trade networks. This standardization emerged from practical necessity as merchants struggled with the complexity of converting between different measurement systems used by various kingdoms and city-states along trade routes. Roman merchants accustomed to standardized imperial measurements found themselves dealing with Chinese units based on entirely different mathematical principles, while Central Asian traders used systems derived from various local traditions. Chinese officials took the initiative in promoting measurement standardization by establishing reference weights and measures in frontier trading cities that foreign merchants could use for verification purposes. These standards, based on Han imperial measurements, provided reliable benchmarks for international transactions. Chinese authorities also trained local officials in conversion techniques that allowed them to translate between Chinese and foreign measurement systems accurately. The adoption of standardized silver currency for high-value transactions solved many of the practical problems associated with long-distance trade. Roman silver coins, particularly denarii and aurei, gained acceptance throughout Central Asian markets due to their consistent weight and purity standards. Chinese merchants learned to evaluate Roman coins based on silver content rather than nominal values, creating a de facto international currency system based on precious metal weight rather than political authority. Sassanid merchants developed sophisticated banking techniques that reduced the risks associated with transporting large quantities of coins across dangerous territories. They established credit arrangements that allowed merchants to deposit silver in Sassanid cities and withdraw equivalent amounts in distant locations, effectively creating the first international banking system. These arrangements required extensive record-keeping and communication networks, but they dramatically reduced the security risks and transportation costs associated with moving precious metals across thousands of miles. The westward transmission of paper-making technology during this period illustrates the broader patterns of technological exchange that accompanied commercial relationships. Chinese paper-making techniques, closely guarded secrets during the Han period, gradually spread westward through Central Asian communities as Chinese artisans settled in trading cities along major routes. The technology's diffusion occurred slowly and unevenly, with each region adapting Chinese methods to local materials and requirements. Samarkand emerged as the first major Central Asian centre for paper production, using techniques learned from Chinese craftsmen who had established workshops in the city during the 2nd century AD. Samarkand papermakers modified Chinese methods to work with local fibre sources, creating papers with different characteristics from Chinese originals. The city's strategic position allowed Samarkand paper to reach both Western and Southern markets, introducing the technology to Persian and eventually Arab territories. The eastward spread of Roman glassmaking techniques created similar patterns of technological adaptation and regional specialization. Roman glass production methods, particularly techniques for creating clear, colorless glass, attracted intense interest from Chinese artisans who had previously worked primarily with colored glass, containing various impurities. Roman merchants brought glass samples to Chinese markets, where local craftsmen analysed the products and attempted to replicate the manufacturing processes. Chinese glassmakers developed hybrid techniques that combined Roman methods with traditional Chinese approaches, creating glass products with unique characteristics that appealed to both domestic and international markets. These innovations included new decorative techniques that incorporated traditional Chinese artistic motifs with Roman technical methods, producing glass objects that commanded premium prices in both Eastern and Western markets. The exchange of agricultural products and cultivation techniques accompanied the more visible trade in luxury goods. Chinese peaches, apricots, and various spices travelled westward along trade routes, while Roman grapes, walnuts, and certain grains moved eastward. These exchanges required careful attention to preservation techniques and transportation methods that could maintain product quality over long distances and extended time periods. Roman wine reached Chinese markets during this period, though in limited quantities due to transportation difficulties and Chinese preferences for different alcoholic beverages. Chinese merchants discovered that Roman wine could be preserved for long-distance transport by adding various spices and honey, creating modified products that appealed to Chinese tastes while maintaining recognizable Roman characteristics. The transmission of medical knowledge and pharmaceutical products created another important dimension of classical period exchanges. Chinese medical texts describing acupuncture techniques and herbal remedies reached Roman territories, where Greek and Roman physicians incorporated selected elements into their own medical practices. Roman medical knowledge, particularly surgical techniques and anatomical understanding, travelled eastward and influenced Chinese medical development. Chinese silk production expanded dramatically during this period to meet growing international demand. New silk-producing regions developed in areas previously devoted to other agricultural activities, while existing production centres invested in improved equipment and techniques that increased both quantity and quality of silk output. The imperial government established quality control standards for export silk that ensured consistent characteristics for international markets. The development of silk dyeing techniques specifically for export markets created new categories of Chinese silk products. Chinese dyers learned to produce colours that matched Roman preferences while maintaining the technical quality that distinguished Chinese silk from inferior imitations produced in other regions. These specialised dyeing processes required imported materials, including certain minerals and plant extracts available only from Western sources, creating reverse trade flows that complemented the primary eastward movement of silver and gold. Regional variations in trade route development reflected local geographical conditions and political circumstances. The northern routes through the Dzungarian Basin, offered advantages during certain seasons, but remained vulnerable to nomadic raids and extreme weather conditions. The southern routes through the Tarim Basin provided more reliable conditions, but required longer travel times, and presented different logistical challenges. Merchants developed specialized knowledge about optimal timing for different route segments, creating complex scheduling systems that maximized travel efficiency while minimizing exposure to seasonal hazards. This expertise became valuable commercial intelligence that successful merchants guarded carefully while sometimes sharing with trusted partners or selling to competitors for substantial fees. The merchant communities that had established themselves across Central Asian trading cities during the classical period created an unexpected foundation for one of history's most significant religious transformations. These commercial networks, initially focused on silk, precious metals, and luxury goods, became the primary conduits for Buddhist ideas, texts, and artistic traditions spreading from India through Central Asia into China. The process began during the 1st century AD, when Indian Buddhist monks discovered that the same caravan routes carrying Chinese silk westward could transport religious teachings eastward with equal efficiency. Buddhist transmission along the Silk Road differed fundamentally from the religion's earlier spread within the Indian subcontinent. Rather than moving through established political structures or existing religious hierarchies, Buddhism travelled through commercial networks where merchants from different cultural backgrounds regularly interacted and exchanged not only goods but ideas, customs, and beliefs. This commercial context shaped how Buddhism adapted to new environments and influenced the particular forms the religion took as it moved across diverse cultural landscapes. The Kushan Empire, which controlled crucial segments of the trade routes during the 1st through 3rd centuries AD, played a decisive role in facilitating Buddhist expansion. Kushan rulers, themselves converts to Buddhism, actively promoted the religion while simultaneously encouraging commercial development. Emperor Kanishka, ruling from approximately 127 to 150 AD, exemplified this dual commitment by commissioning Buddhist art and architecture while maintaining policies that attracted merchants from across the known world to Kushan territories. Kanishka's capital at Peshawar became a major centre for both Buddhist scholarship and international commerce. The city's monasteries housed monks from India, Central Asia, and China who collaborated on translating Sanskrit Buddhist texts into various local languages. These translation projects required extensive knowledge of multiple languages and cultures, skills that the international merchant communities possessed in abundance. Merchants often served as interpreters and cultural mediators, helping monks understand local customs and religious practices that needed to be considered when adapting Buddhist teachings for new audiences. The Gandhara region, encompassing parts of modern Pakistan and Afghanistan, emerged as the primary artistic centre, where Buddhist iconography absorbed influences from Greek, Roman, Persian, and Central Asian artistic traditions. This cultural synthesis occurred because Gandhara's position along major trade routes brought together artisans and patrons from diverse backgrounds who contributed different aesthetic preferences and technical skills to Buddhist art production. The resulting Gandhara school of Buddhist art featured realistic human figures with Greek-influenced facial features, Roman-style drapery, and Persian decorative motifs, creating a distinctive international artistic language. Gandhara sculptors developed standardized iconographic conventions for depicting Buddhist figures that could be understood across different cultural contexts. These artistic standards travelled along trade routes with merchant caravans, spreading consistent visual representations of Buddhist concepts to distant regions. A merchant familiar with Gandhara Buddhist art could recognise similar iconographic elements in Buddhist sculptures produced in Khotan, Kucha or Chang'an, creating visual continuity across the vast geographical expanse of the Silk Road network. The monastery complex at Bamiyan, situated in a strategic mountain valley connecting Central Asian steppes with Indian territories, became one of the most important Buddhist centres along the trade routes. The site's massive Buddha statues, carved directly into cliff faces during the 3rd through 6th centuries AD, served multiple functions beyond their obvious religious significance. These monuments marked Bamiyan's location for travellers navigating through complex mountain terrain, while their impressive scale demonstrated the wealth and devotion of the local Buddhist community to passing merchants and pilgrims. Bamiyan's monasteries provided essential services for long-distance travellers, including secure accommodation, medical care, and spiritual guidance. The monks maintained detailed knowledge of regional geography and seasonal travel conditions, offering route advice that proved invaluable for merchant caravans attempting to cross dangerous mountain passes. This practical assistance created positive relationships between Buddhist communities and commercial networks, encouraging merchants to support monastery construction and maintenance through donations and patronage. The monastic communities at Bamiyan developed sophisticated agricultural and craft production systems that made them largely self-sufficient while generating surplus goods for trade. Monks produced high-quality textiles, metalwork, and agricultural products that commanded premium prices in regional markets. These economic activities provided monasteries with steady income streams that supported their religious functions, while demonstrating Buddhist principles of productive labour and community service. Buddhist merchants played crucial roles in transmitting religious ideas because their commercial activities required them to build trust relationships with trading partners from different cultural backgrounds. These business relationships often evolved into discussions about philosophical and religious topics, creating opportunities for Buddhist merchants to share their beliefs with interested colleagues. The gradual, personal nature of these exchanges proved more effective than formal missionary activities in many contexts. Sogdian merchants, who dominated much of the Central Asian trade during the 4th through 8th centuries AD, became particularly important agents of Buddhist transmission. Their extensive commercial networks connected Buddhist communities across thousands of miles, while their linguistic skills enabled them to translate Buddhist concepts between different languages and cultural contexts. Sogdian Buddhist merchants established temples and monasteries in cities throughout Central Asia, creating a network of religious institutions that supported both spiritual and commercial activities. The Sogdian language became a lingua franca for Buddhist texts and correspondence across Central Asia during this period. Sogdian translations of Sanskrit Buddhist scriptures made these teachings accessible to populations who could not read Sanskrit or Chinese, while Sogdian Buddhist correspondence connected monasteries and merchant communities across vast distances. Archaeological discoveries of Sogdian Buddhist documents from sites like Dunhuang reveal the extensive communication networks that linked Buddhist communities along the trade routes. Dunhuang emerged as perhaps the most significant Buddhist centre along the eastern sections of the Silk Road, combining religious, commercial and cultural functions in ways that exemplify the integration of Buddhism with trade route society. The city's location at the convergence of multiple trade routes made it a natural gathering point for merchants, pilgrims and scholars travelling between China and Central Asia. This cosmopolitan environment created ideal conditions for Buddhist development and artistic innovation. The Mogao caves at Dunhuang, carved and decorated between the 4th and 14th centuries AD, represent the most comprehensive record of Buddhist art and culture along the Silk Road. These cave temples, numbering nearly 500 individual chambers, contain Buddhist paintings, sculptures and manuscripts that document the evolution of Buddhist artistic styles and religious practices across nearly a millennium. The caves also reveal the central role of merchant patronage in supporting Buddhist art production, with many chambers containing donor portraits of wealthy merchants and their families. Dunhuang's scriptoriums produce Buddhist texts in multiple languages and scripts, serving the diverse linguistic needs of the international community that frequented the city. Monks and scribes working in Dunhuang created Chinese translations of Sanskrit and Central Asian Buddhist texts, while also producing original commentaries and interpretations that reflected local understanding of Buddhist teachings. The famous library cave at Dunhuang, sealed in the 11th century and rediscovered in 1900, contained over 40,000 manuscripts and printed documents that provide unprecedented insight into Buddhist intellectual life along the Silk Road. The transmission of Buddhism to China required extensive adaptation of Indian religious concepts to Chinese philosophical and cultural frameworks. This process involved not just translation of Sanskrit terms into Chinese language, but fundamental reinterpretation of Buddhist ideas to make them comprehensible within Chinese intellectual traditions. Early Chinese Buddhist translators struggled with concepts like karma and rebirth that had no direct equivalents in Chinese thought, leading to creative solutions that combined Buddhist and Chinese ideas in new ways. Kumarajiva, a Buddhist monk from Kucha who reached Chang'an in 401 AD, revolutionized Chinese Buddhism through his translation work and teaching activities. Born to an Indian father and Kuchean mother, Kumarajiva possessed the multicultural background necessary to bridge Indian Buddhist scholarship with Chinese intellectual traditions. His translations of major Mahayana texts, including the Lotus Sutra and works by Nagarjuna, established Chinese Buddhist terminology and interpretative frameworks that influenced Chinese Buddhism for centuries. Kumarajiva's translation methodology emphasized meaning over literal accuracy, allowing him to render complex Sanskrit philosophical concepts in Chinese terms that captured essential Buddhist ideas while remaining comprehensible to Chinese readers. His translation team, which included both Chinese and Central Asian scholars, developed systematic approaches to handling Sanskrit terms that had no Chinese equivalents. These innovations created a distinctively Chinese Buddhist vocabulary that enabled the religion to develop independently of its Indian origins. The Chinese Buddhist pilgrim Faxian, who travelled from China to India between 399 and 414 AD, documented the extensive Buddhist communities he encountered along the Silk Road routes. His detailed travel account describes flourishing monasteries in cities like Khotan, Kashgar, and Gandhara, revealing how completely Buddhism had integrated into the commercial and cultural life of these trading centres. Faxian's observations provide crucial evidence for understanding how Buddhism functioned within Silk Road society during the early 5th century AD. Faxian's journey illustrates the close connections between commercial and religious travel along the Silk Road. He frequently travelled with merchant caravans for security and logistical support, while his religious status provided him with accommodation and assistance from Buddhist communities along his route. His account describes the practical arrangements that enabled long-distance religious travel, including the network of monasteries that provided hospitality for travelling monks and pilgrims. The most famous Chinese Buddhist pilgrim, Xuanzang, undertook his journey to India between 629 and 645 AD during the Tang dynasty's Golden Age. His travels coincided with a period of unprecedented prosperity and cultural exchange along the Silk Road, allowing him to observe Buddhist communities at their peak of development and influence. Xuanzang's detailed records provide comprehensive documentation of Buddhist institutions, practices and scholarly activities across Central Asia and India during the 7th century AD. Xuanzang's translation work after his return to China represented the culmination of several centuries of Chinese Buddhist development. His translations, produced with support from the Tang imperial court, achieved unprecedented accuracy and completeness in rendering Sanskrit Buddhist texts into Chinese. The Translation Bureau established for Xuanzang's work employed dozens of scholars fluent in Sanskrit, Chinese, and various Central Asian languages, creating the most sophisticated translation operation in medieval history. The artistic traditions that developed at Buddhist sites along the Silk Road reflected the cosmopolitan nature of these trading communities. Buddhist art in cities like Kyzyl, Kumtura, and Bezeklik incorporated artistic elements from India, Persia, Central Asia, and China, creating distinctive regional styles that could not have developed in isolation from the cultural exchanges facilitated by long-distance trade. These artistic syntheses demonstrate how Buddhism served as a vehicle for broader cultural integration across the Silk Road network. The cave temples at Kizil dating from the 3rd through 8th centuries AD contain some of the finest examples of Central Asian Buddhist art. The paintings in these caves combine Indian Buddhist iconography with Persian decorative motifs and Central Asian artistic techniques, creating a unique aesthetic that influenced Buddhist art development across the region. The Kizil paintings also reveal the ethnic diversity of Buddhist communities, depicting donors and worshippers with distinctly different facial features and clothing styles, representing various Central Asian populations. Buddhist monasteries along the trade routes developed economic functions that extended far beyond their religious activities. These institutions served as banks, providing secure storage for merchants' valuables and offering credit arrangements for commercial transactions. Monasteries also functioned as information centres, where merchants could obtain current intelligence about market conditions, political developments, and route safety in distant regions. These services created mutually beneficial relationships between Buddhist communities and commercial networks. The integration of Buddhist institutions into Silk Road economic systems enabled monasteries to accumulate substantial wealth that supported ambitious construction projects and artistic commissions. The massive scale of Buddhist monuments at sites like Bamiyan, Yungang, and Longmen required enormous financial resources that could only be generated through successful participation in long-distance trade networks. These projects in turn attracted skilled artisans from across the known world, creating centres of artistic innovation and cultural exchange. Buddhist festivals and ceremonies became important social events in Silk Road cities, bringing together diverse populations for shared religious and cultural experiences. These gatherings provided opportunities for merchants from different backgrounds to develop personal relationships that facilitated business transactions, while also creating forums for cultural exchange and artistic collaboration. The international character of Buddhist communities along the trade routes made these religious institutions natural centres for cross-cultural interaction and communication. The decline of Buddhism in Central Asia during the 8th through 10th centuries AD coincided with changing political and economic conditions that disrupted the traditional patterns of Silk Road trade. The rise of Islamic powers in Central Asia created new religious and cultural dynamics, while political instability reduced the security and profitability of long-distance commerce. However, the Buddhist artistic and architectural traditions established during the religion's golden age along the Silk Road continued to influence cultural development across the region for centuries after Buddhism's political decline. The establishment of the Tang dynasty in 618 AD marked the beginning of the most prosperous and culturally dynamic period in Silk Road history. Unlike their predecessors, the Tang emperors pursued an aggressive expansionist policy that extended Chinese control deep into Central Asia, creating the largest empire in Chinese history and establishing direct administrative control over vast stretches of the trade routes that had previously operated under loose diplomatic arrangements. Emperor Taizong's military campaigns during the 630s and 640s AD systematically conquered the Tarim Basin kingdoms that had maintained semi-independent status for centuries. The conquest of Gaochang in 640 AD eliminated the last major independent power in the eastern Tarim Basin, while subsequent campaigns against Kucha, Kashgar, and other oasis cities brought the entire region under direct Chinese administration. These conquests differed from earlier Chinese involvement in Central Asia, which had relied primarily on tributary relationships and diplomatic alliances rather than direct territorial control. The Tang Protectorate system, known as the Protectorate General to pacify the West, established Chinese military garrisons and administrative centres throughout Central Asia. The Protectorate headquarters at Kucha controlled a network of fortified positions extending from Dunhuang in the east to Samarkand in the west, with subsidiary commands at Kashgar, Khotan and Karashar. Each garrison maintained several hundred Chinese soldiers supported by local auxiliary troops, creating a military presence capable of protecting trade routes and enforcing imperial policies across thousands of miles of territory. Chinese military engineers constructed an extensive network of beacon towers and fortified way stations that provided communication and logistical support for the Protectorate forces. These installations, spaced at regular intervals along major trade routes, enabled rapid transmission of military intelligence and administrative orders across the vast distances of Central Asia. The beacon tower system could relay urgent messages from Kashgar to Chang'an in less than 10 days, a remarkable achievement given the geographical obstacles involved. The Protectorate system required unprecedented administrative sophistication to govern the diverse populations and complex economic relationships of Central Asian territories. Chinese officials developed specialized knowledge of local languages, customs, and legal traditions, while implementing imperial policies that accommodated regional variations in social organization and economic practices. The Tang legal code was modified to address situations unique to Central Asian territories, including regulations for managing international trade, resolving disputes between merchants from different countries, and maintaining security along caravan routes. Chang'an, the Tang capital, experienced explosive growth during this period as it became the eastern terminus of an integrated trade network extending across the entire Eurasian continent. The city's population reached approximately 1 million inhabitants by 700 AD, making it the largest city in the world at that time. Chang'an's cosmopolitan character reflected its position at the center of international trade networks, with foreign merchants, diplomats, and scholars comprising a significant portion of the urban population. The Western market in Chang'an occupied over 1,600 acres and contained more than 3,000 shops organized into specialized sections for different categories of goods. The market's international character was immediately apparent to visitors, who encountered merchants speaking dozens of languages while selling products from across the known world. Persian carpets, Indian spices, Central Asian horses, and Byzantine goldwork competed for space with Chinese silk, porcelain, and lacquerware in a commercial environment unlike anything previously seen in human history. Foreign merchants in Chang'an established permanent communities with their own temples, schools, and social organizations that maintained cultural connections to their homelands while adapting to Chinese urban life. The Sogdian merchant community, numbering several thousand individuals, constructed elaborate mansions in the city's western districts and commissioned Chinese artisans to create hybrid architectural styles that combined Central Asian and Chinese design elements. These residences featured traditional Chinese courtyard layouts with Persian-influenced decorative motifs and Central Asian furniture arrangements. The Tang government's policies toward foreign merchants reflected a sophisticated understanding of international commerce that balanced revenue generation with the need to maintain attractive conditions for long-distance traders. Imperial officials established standardized taxation rates for imported goods that were high enough to generate substantial government revenue, but not so excessive as to discourage trade. The government also provided security services, maintained commercial infrastructure, and offered legal protections that made Chang'an an attractive destination for merchants from across Eurasia. Tang customs officials developed detailed classification systems for imported goods that enabled precise taxation while preventing disputes over commodity categories and valuations. These systems required extensive knowledge of foreign products and manufacturing techniques, leading to the creation of specialized bureaucratic positions for officials with international commercial expertise. The government maintained reference collections of foreign goods that customs officials could use to verify the authenticity and quality of imported merchandise. The diversification of trade goods during the Tang period transformed the character of Silk Road commerce from its earlier focus on luxury items for elite consumers. While silk remained an important export product, Chinese merchants began shipping porcelain, tea, paper, and various manufactured goods that appealed to broader market segments in foreign countries. This diversification reflected both increased production capacity in China and growing demand for Chinese products among middle-class consumers in Central Asian and Middle Eastern markets. Chinese porcelain production expanded dramatically during the Tang period as potters developed new techniques for creating high-quality ceramics that could survive the rigours of long-distance transportation. Tang porcelain featured distinctive glazes and decorative styles that appealed to foreign consumers while maintaining the technical superiority that distinguished Chinese ceramics from products manufactured in other regions. The development of specialized packing techniques using straw, silk padding and wooden containers enabled porcelain to reach distant markets without significant breakage. Tea cultivation and processing emerged as major Chinese export industries during the Tang period, introducing this beverage to Central Asian and Middle Eastern populations who had previously been unfamiliar with tea consumption. Chinese merchants discovered that tea's lightweight and high value made it ideal for long-distance trade, while its preservation qualities enabled it to maintain quality during extended transportation periods. The development of compressed tea bricks specifically for export markets created standardized products that could be easily transported and traded. The westward transmission of paper-making technology accelerated during the Tang period as Chinese artisans established workshops in Central Asian cities under imperial sponsorship. These government-supported technology transfers were designed to create local paper production capacity that could support Chinese administrative activities while generating additional export revenue. The paper workshops at Samarkand, established with Chinese technical assistance during the 8th century AD, became major suppliers for Middle Eastern markets and contributed to the eventual spread of paper-making technology to the Islamic world. Incoming trade goods reflected the unprecedented geographical scope of Tang commercial networks. Arabian horses, prized for their speed and endurance, arrived in Chang'an through Central Asian intermediaries who had developed specialized knowledge of equine breeding and training. These horses commanded enormous prices in Chinese markets, where military officials and wealthy civilians competed to acquire animals with superior bloodlines and proven performance capabilities. Precious stones from various regions created new categories of luxury goods in Chinese markets. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, rubies from Burma, and pearls from the Persian Gulf reached Chang'an through complex trading networks that involved multiple intermediaries and transportation methods. Chinese artisans developed new jewelry-making techniques specifically designed to showcase these foreign gemstones, creating hybrid artistic styles that combine traditional Chinese metalworking with international decorative elements. Spices and aromatics from India and Southeast Asia transformed Chinese cuisine and religious practices during this period. Black pepper, cardamom, and various other spices that had previously been unknown in China became important ingredients in both imperial court cuisine and popular cooking. The importation of frankincense and other aromatic substances supported the expansion of Buddhist religious practices while creating new categories of luxury consumption among wealthy Chinese families. The cultural flowering that occurred along the Silk Road during the Tang period reflected the unprecedented level of international interaction facilitated by political stability and economic prosperity. Chinese poets, musicians and artists absorbed influences from Central Asian traditions while contributing their own innovations to the cosmopolitan culture that developed in major trading cities. This cultural synthesis produced artistic achievements that could not have emerged in isolation from the international exchanges enabled by long-distance trade. Tang poetry reached its greatest heights during this period, with poets like Li Bai and Du Fu creating works that incorporated imagery and themes derived from their exposure to foreign cultures and landscapes. Li Bai's poems frequently reference Central Asian geography, foreign customs, and international travel experiences that reflected the cosmopolitan environment of Tang society. His famous poem, The Road to Shu, drew upon his knowledge of the dangerous mountain routes that connected China with Central Asian territories. creating literary works that captured the adventurous spirit of the Silk Road era. Musical exchanges between Chinese and Central Asian traditions produced new instrumental techniques and compositional styles that influenced court entertainment and popular culture. The pipa, a stringed instrument derived from Central Asian prototypes, became central to Tang court music while undergoing modifications that adapted it to Chinese musical preferences. Chinese musicians learned Central Asian playing techniques, while developing new musical forms that combined Chinese melodic structures with foreign rhythmic patterns. Dance traditions from various Central Asian cultures merged with Chinese performance styles to create new forms of entertainment that became popular in both court and commercial contexts. The Western region dance performed in Tang palaces incorporated movements, costumes, and musical accompaniment derived from Sogdian, Persian, and Turkish traditions, while maintaining Chinese aesthetic principles. These performances required extensive cultural knowledge and artistic skill, creating new categories of professional entertainers who specialized in international performance styles. The Tang imperial court's patronage of international artists and scholars created an environment that encouraged cultural innovation and artistic experimentation. Foreign musicians, painters, and craftsmen received imperial commissions that provided them with resources and status, while exposing Chinese audiences to artistic traditions from across Eurasia. The court maintained workshops where Chinese and foreign artisans collaborated on projects that combined different technical traditions and aesthetic approaches. Religious architecture along the Silk Road during the Tang period reflected the diverse spiritual traditions that coexisted in the cosmopolitan trading cities. Buddhist temples incorporated architectural elements from Indian, Persian, and Central Asian traditions, while maintaining Chinese structural principles. The giant wild goose pagoda in Chang'an, built to house Buddhist scriptures brought from India by Xuanzang, exemplified the international character of Tang religious architecture through its combination of Chinese construction techniques with Indian influence proportions and decorative elements. Zoroastrian fire temples in Chinese cities served Persian merchant communities, while introducing Chinese populations to foreign religious practices and architectural styles. These temples featured distinctive design elements that accommodated Zoroastrian ritual requirements while conforming to Chinese building regulations and aesthetic preferences. The coexistence of multiple religious traditions in Tang cities created unprecedented opportunities for theological dialogue and philosophical exchange. The Nestorian Christian community in Chang'an constructed churches that combined Byzantine architectural principles with Chinese construction techniques and decorative styles. The famous Nestorian stele, erected in 781 AD, documented the history of Christianity in China while demonstrating the sophisticated theological knowledge that developed through contact between Chinese and Middle Eastern Christian traditions. The stele's bilingual inscription in Chinese and Syriac reflected the multicultural character of religious communities along the Silk Road. Islamic merchants and scholars began appearing in Chinese cities during the later Tang period, introducing another major religious tradition to the cosmopolitan mix of Silk Road society. The construction of the first mosques in Chinese territory required architectural innovations that adapted Islamic spatial requirements to Chinese building traditions and urban planning principles. These early mosques established precedents for Islamic architecture in China that influenced religious building design for centuries. The Tang government's policies toward foreign religions reflected a pragmatic approach that balanced tolerance for diversity with concern for social stability and political control. Imperial officials generally permitted foreign religious practices as long as they did not challenge political authority or disrupt social order. This tolerance created an environment where different religious traditions could coexist and interact, leading to theological exchanges and philosophical syntheses that enriched the intellectual life of Silk Road communities. Commercial law during the Tang period evolved to address the complex legal issues that arose from international trade relationships. Chinese legal officials developed expertise in foreign commercial practices and contractual arrangements, while creating new legal procedures for resolving disputes between merchants from different countries with different legal traditions. The Tang Legal Code included specific provisions for international commercial transactions that established precedents for medieval international trade law. The standardization of weights, measures, and currency across Tang territories facilitated commercial transactions while reducing opportunities for fraud and disputes. Imperial officials established reference standards in major trading cities that merchants could use to verify the accuracy of their measuring equipment and currency. These standards were regularly updated and maintained by specialized bureaucratic offices that ensured consistency across the vast geographical extent of the Tang Empire. Banking and credit arrangements became increasingly sophisticated during this period as merchants developed new financial instruments to manage the risks and complexities of long-distance trade. Chinese merchants established correspondent relationships with foreign trading partners that enabled them to conduct business without transporting large quantities of precious metals across dangerous territories. These arrangements required extensive trust networks and communication systems that connected commercial communities across thousands of miles. The Tang postal system, originally designed for government communications, expanded to provide commercial messaging services that enabled merchants to coordinate business activities across vast distances. The system's network of post stations and relay riders could transmit commercial correspondence from Chang'an to Central Asian cities in a matter of weeks, enabling business relationships that would have been impossible without reliable communication infrastructure. The decline of Tang authority in Central Asia during the mid-8th century created a power vacuum that Arab military forces rapidly exploited, fundamentally altering the political, commercial, and cultural landscape of the Silk Road. The Arab conquest of Transoxiana, beginning with the capture of Bukhara in 709 AD and culminating in the decisive victory over Chinese forces at the Battle of Talas in 751 AD, marked the end of Chinese political dominance in Western Central Asia and initiated a new phase of Islamic influence that would reshape trade networks across the entire region. The Battle of Talas itself proved less significant for its immediate military consequences than for its long-term cultural and technological implications. The Arab victory, achieved through superior cavalry tactics and strategic alliance with local Turkic forces dissatisfied with Chinese rule, resulted in the capture of numerous Chinese prisoners, including skilled artisans and craftsmen whose knowledge would prove invaluable to Islamic technological development. Among these prisoners were papermakers whose expertise enabled the establishment of paper production facilities in Samarkand, marking the beginning of paper-making technology's westward transmission into the Islamic world. The Umayyad and subsequent Abbasid administrations approached Central Asian governance with pragmatic flexibility that differed markedly from earlier Chinese administrative methods. Rather than imposing uniform Islamic law across diverse populations, Arab administrators developed accommodating policies that permitted local customs to continue alongside Islamic practices, provided they did not directly contradict fundamental Islamic principles. This approach proved particularly effective in maintaining commercial relationships with non-Muslim merchants and communities whose participation remained essential for trade network operations. The conversion process in Central Asian territories proceeded gradually and unevenly, often following commercial and social networks rather than administrative boundaries. Sogdian merchant families, recognizing the advantages of religious affiliation with the new ruling elite, frequently adopted Islam while maintaining their established business relationships and commercial practices. These conversions created hybrid cultural forms that combined Islamic religious observance with traditional Central Asian commercial customs and social arrangements. Samarkand emerged as the preeminent Islamic commercial centre in Central Asia during the 9th and 10th centuries, surpassing even Baghdad in certain categories of international trade. The city's strategic position at the convergence of routes from China, India, Persia, and the Middle East made it an ideal location for the complex commercial operations that characterized Islamic period trade. Samarkand's markets specialized in high-value goods requiring sophisticated commercial expertise, including Chinese silk, Indian precious stones, Persian carpets, and various luxury manufactured products from across the Islamic world. The Samanid dynasty, ruling from Bukhara between 875 and 999 AD, created the most successful synthesis of Islamic governance with Central Asian commercial traditions. The Samanids maintained nominal allegiance to the Abbasid Caliphate while exercising practical independence in managing their territory's economic and commercial affairs. Their policies actively encouraged long-distance trade through infrastructure investment, legal standardization, and diplomatic arrangements that facilitated merchant activities across their extensive territories. Samanid silver mines in the Panjshir Valley and other locations provided the monetary foundation for expanded commercial activities throughout Central Asia and beyond. The consistent quality and weight of Samanid silver dirhams made them the preferred currency for international transactions across a vast geographical area extending from the Baltic Sea to the Indian Ocean. Archaeological evidence reveals Samanid coins in Scandinavian hoards, indicating the remarkable geographical scope of trade networks that utilized Samanid silver as a medium of exchange. The standardization of Islamic commercial law across Central Asian territories eliminated many of the legal complexities that had previously complicated international trade relationships. Islamic legal scholars developed comprehensive frameworks for handling commercial disputes, contractual arrangements, and partnership agreements that could be applied consistently across different regions and cultural contexts. The concept of the Islamic Ummah, or community of believers, created legal presumptions of trustworthiness and shared obligations that facilitated business relationships between merchants who had never met personally. The development of the Hawala system during this period revolutionized long-distance commercial finance by enabling merchants to transfer funds across vast distances without physically transporting precious metals or coins. This system relied on networks of trusted agents who maintained detailed records of financial obligations and periodically settled accounts through various compensation mechanisms. A merchant in Bukhara could deposit silver with a local Hawala agent and authorize a colleague in Damascus to collect equivalent value from the agent's correspondent, eliminating the risks and costs associated with transporting currency across dangerous territories. Hawala operations required extensive communication networks and sophisticated record-keeping systems that connected commercial communities across the Islamic world. The system's effectiveness depended on the reliability of participating agents and the accuracy of exchange rate information transmitted between different commercial centres. Islamic merchants developed standardized procedures for calculating exchange rates, accounting for transportation costs, and managing the timing differences involved in long-distance financial transactions. The integration of Islamic territories into existing Silk Road networks proceeded through gradual modification of established commercial practices rather than wholesale replacement of existing systems. Islamic merchants learned to work within traditional Central Asian trading customs while introducing new financial instruments and legal frameworks that enhanced commercial efficiency. This pragmatic approach enabled Islamic commercial expansion without disrupting the fundamental economic relationships that sustained long-distance trade. Bukhara's rise as a major intellectual centre complemented its commercial importance, creating a unique environment where Islamic scholarship flourished alongside international trade activities. The city's madrasas attracted students from across the Islamic world, while its libraries preserved and transmitted classical texts from Greek, Persian, and Indian sources. The famous physician and philosopher Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, spent his formative years in Bukhara, where he had access to an extraordinary collection of philosophical and scientific manuscripts that shaped his intellectual development. The translation movement that characterized Islamic intellectual life during the 9th and 10th centuries relied heavily on the cosmopolitan, commercial networks that connected Islamic territories with other cultural regions. Merchants travelling to India, China, and Byzantine territories frequently carried manuscripts and books that they sold to Islamic scholars and libraries. This commercial trade in intellectual materials enabled Islamic scholars to access Greek philosophical texts, Indian mathematical treatises, and Chinese scientific works that would have been otherwise unavailable. Islamic scholars working in Central Asian cities like Samarkand and Bukhara developed sophisticated techniques for translating and preserving classical knowledge from various cultural traditions. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad served as the most famous centre for this activity, but similar institutions in Central Asian cities played equally important roles in preserving and transmitting classical learning. These scholarly activities often receive financial support from wealthy merchants who recognize the practical value of scientific and mathematical knowledge for their commercial operations. The preservation of Greek philosophical texts through Arabic translations proved crucial for the eventual transmission of classical knowledge to medieval Europe. Islamic scholars not only translated Greek works, but also wrote extensive commentaries that clarified difficult concepts and connected Greek philosophical ideas with Islamic theological principles. These commentaries often incorporated insights from Persian and Indian philosophical traditions that Islamic scholars had encountered through commercial and cultural exchanges along the Silk Road. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge from Indian sources reached Islamic scholars primarily through commercial networks that connected Central Asian cities with Indian trading centres. Islamic mathematicians learned Indian numerical systems and computational techniques that they refined and transmitted throughout the Islamic world. The adoption of Indian numerical notation, including the concept of zero, revolutionized mathematical calculation and enabled the development of more sophisticated commercial accounting systems. Chinese technological knowledge reached Islamic territories through various channels, including captured artisans, diplomatic exchanges, and commercial relationships with Chinese merchants who continued to operate in Central Asian markets despite the political changes following the Battle of Talas. Islamic craftsmen learned Chinese techniques for silk production, porcelain manufacture, and metallurgy, adapting these technologies to local conditions and market requirements. The westward transmission of paper-making technology from Samarkand to other Islamic cities created a revolution in administrative and intellectual life throughout the Islamic world. Paper production facilities established in Baghdad, Damascus, and other major cities provided affordable writing materials that enabled the expansion of bureaucratic record-keeping, commercial documentation, and scholarly writing. The availability of inexpensive paper facilitated the development of Islamic banking systems that required extensive written records of financial transactions. Islamic merchants developed new categories of trade goods that reflected the religious and cultural preferences of Islamic consumers. The prohibition on silk clothing for men in Islamic law created demand for alternative luxury textiles, leading to increased trade in fine wool fabrics, cotton textiles, and various blended materials. Islamic merchants also specialized in trade goods that supported religious observance, including prayer rugs, incense, and various items used in mosque decoration and religious ceremonies. The pilgrimage trade to Mecca created new commercial opportunities that Islamic merchants along the Silk Road exploited effectively. Pilgrims travelling from Central Asia, China, and other distant regions required transportation, accommodation, and various goods and services during their journeys. Islamic merchants established specialized businesses that catered to pilgrim needs. while also using pilgrimage routes to transport commercial goods between different regions of the Islamic world. The development of Islamic commercial partnerships, known as Mudarabah arrangements, enabled merchants to pool resources and share risks in ways that facilitated larger and more ambitious trading ventures. These partnerships typically involved one party providing capital while another contributed labour and expertise, with profits shared according to predetermined formulas. The legal framework governing Mudarabah relationships provided security for investors while enabling entrepreneurial merchants to access capital for trading activities. Islamic commercial law's emphasis on ethical business practices and fair dealing created trust relationships that facilitated long-distance trade even between merchants who belonged to different ethnic or cultural groups. The Islamic prohibition on usury led to the development of alternative financing mechanisms that achieved similar economic functions without violating religious principles. These innovations in commercial finance enabled Islamic merchants to compete effectively with non-Islamic trading networks while maintaining religious compliance. The expansion of Islamic influence along the Silk Road coincided with significant technological innovations in transportation and logistics. Islamic merchants developed improved caravan organization techniques that increased the efficiency and safety of long-distance travel. These improvements included better methods for loading and securing cargo, more effective systems for managing pack animals, and enhanced security arrangements that reduced losses from banditry and natural hazards. The construction of caravanserais at regular intervals along major trade routes provided standardized accommodation and services for traveling merchants. These facilities, typically built around fortified courtyards with secure storage areas and animal pens, offered protection from both weather and human threats. The caravanserais also served as information centers where merchants could obtain current intelligence about market conditions, route safety, and political developments in distant regions. Islamic urban planning in Central Asian cities reflected the integration of commercial and religious functions that characterized Islamic civilization. The central bazaars in cities like Samarkand and Bukhara were typically located near the main mosques, creating commercial districts where religious and economic activities reinforced each other. The architectural design of these commercial areas facilitated both individual transactions and large-scale wholesale operations that supplied regional distribution networks. The development of Islamic banking houses in major commercial centers created institutional support for long-distance trade that exceeded anything previously available in Central Asian territories. These institutions provided currency exchange services, commercial credit, and various financial instruments that reduced the risks and costs associated with international commerce. The banking houses maintained correspondent relationships with similar institutions in other cities, creating integrated financial networks that supported commercial activities across vast geographical areas. The integration of Turkic peoples into Islamic commercial networks during the 10th and 11th centuries brought new energy and resources to Silk Road trade. Turkic merchants and military leaders who converted to Islam maintained their traditional expertise in horse breeding and nomadic logistics, while adopting Islamic commercial practices and legal frameworks. This combination of nomadic mobility with Islamic commercial sophistication created powerful new trading organizations that dominated certain segments of Central Asian commerce. The Ghaznavid Empire, established by Turkic military leaders who had converted to Islam, created new political conditions that affected Silk Road trade patterns during the late 10th and early 11th centuries. The Ghaznavids' military campaigns in India opened new trade routes and markets, while their control over key Central Asian territories influenced the flow of goods between China, India, and the Middle East. Their capital at Ghazni became an important commercial centre that connected Indian Ocean trade networks with traditional Silk Road routes. The fragmented political landscape that had characterized Central Asia since the decline of unified Islamic authority created the perfect conditions for the most dramatic transformation in Silk Road history. By the early 13th century, the Khwarezmid Empire controlled much of Transoxiana and eastern Iran, while various Turkic and local rulers governed smaller territories throughout the region. Chinese authority had long since retreated to areas east of the Jade Gate, leaving the western portions of traditional trade routes under the control of competing local powers who frequently disrupted commercial activities through warfare, excessive taxation, and arbitrary policy changes. Into this fractured political environment emerged Temujin, later known as Genghis Khan, whose military innovations and organizational genius would create the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Born around 1162 AD into a minor Mongol clan struggling for survival on the harsh steppes north of China, Temujin's early experiences with tribal warfare, resource scarcity and political instability shaped his understanding of the relationship between military power and economic prosperity. His rise to supremacy among the Mongol tribes between 1196 and 1206 AD demonstrated unprecedented ability to integrate diverse nomadic groups into a unified military organization capable of conquering sedentary civilizations. The Mongol military system that Genghis Khan developed represented a revolutionary synthesis of traditional steppe warfare tactics with innovative organizational structures and strategic concepts borrowed from various sources. Mongol armies organized around decimal units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 warriors created flexible command structures that could adapt rapidly to changing battlefield conditions. Each warrior maintained multiple horses, enabling Mongol forces to cover vast distances at speeds that consistently surprised their enemies and disrupted conventional defensive preparations. Mongol siege warfare capabilities, initially limited by their nomadic background, expanded dramatically through the systematic recruitment of Chinese, Persian, and Central Asian engineers and craftsmen who possessed specialized knowledge of fortification construction and siege equipment operation. The Mongols' willingness to adopt and improve upon foreign military technologies, combined with their ability to coordinate massive siege operations involving tens of thousands of workers, enabled them to capture fortified cities that had previously been considered impregnable. The conquest of the Western Xia Kingdom between 1205 and 1209 AD provided Genghis Khan with his first experience in governing sedentary agricultural populations whose economic systems differed fundamentally from nomadic pastoral traditions. The Mongols discovered that systematic exploitation of agricultural surplus could generate far greater wealth than traditional nomadic raiding, leading to the development of administrative policies that balanced extraction of resources with maintenance of productive capacity. These early experiments in sedentary governance provided crucial experience that influenced later Mongol administration of much larger and more complex territories. The Jin dynasty's territories in northern China presented the Mongols with their most challenging military and administrative obstacles during the campaigns that began in 1211 AD. The Jin possessed sophisticated defensive systems, professional armies equipped with advanced weaponry, and complex bureaucratic structures that had governed millions of people for over a century. Mongol success against the Jin required not only military conquest but also the development of administrative capabilities that could manage Chinese agricultural systems, urban populations, and commercial networks without destroying the economic foundations that made these territories valuable. Mongol administrative practices in conquered Chinese territories demonstrated remarkable pragmatism in adapting traditional Chinese governmental systems to Mongol requirements. Rather than replacing Chinese bureaucrats wholesale, the Mongols retained experienced administrators while installing Mongol supervisors who monitored their activities and ensured compliance with imperial policies. This approach preserved essential administrative expertise while establishing Mongol political control over complex governmental systems that would have been impossible for nomadic administrators to operate independently. The destruction of the Khwarezmid Empire between 1219 and 1221 AD eliminated the last major obstacle to Mongol control over Central Asian trade routes, but the campaign's devastating impact on urban centres like Samarkand, Bukhara and Merv initially disrupted commercial activities throughout the region. Contemporary accounts describe the wholesale destruction of irrigation systems, the massacre of urban populations, and the abandonment of agricultural areas that had supported trade route cities for centuries. These destructive campaigns reflected Genghis Khan's strategic calculation that complete elimination of resistance was preferable to prolonged occupation warfare that would tie down Mongol forces needed for other conquests. The recovery of Central Asian commercial centres following their initial destruction revealed the Mongols' growing understanding of the relationship between urban prosperity and imperial revenue. Mongol administrators began implementing policies designed to attract merchants and craftsmen back to devastated cities, offering tax incentives, security guarantees, and infrastructure investments that gradually restored commercial activities. The reconstruction of Samarkand during the 1220s exemplified this approach, as Mongol officials recruited skilled artisans from various regions and provided them with resources and protection needed to re-establish productive workshops and commercial facilities. Genghis Khan's legal innovations, codified in the Yasa, established uniform standards for commercial transactions, criminal justice, and administrative procedures across the vast expanse of Mongol territories. The Yasa's provisions regarding merchant protection, contract enforcement, and dispute resolution created legal frameworks that facilitated long-distance trade by reducing uncertainties and risks that had previously complicated international commercial relationships. Merchants operating under Mongol protection could rely on consistent legal treatment, regardless of their ethnic background or the specific territories through which they travelled. The Mongol postal system, known as the Yam, represented the most sophisticated communication network in medieval history, enabling rapid transmission of information across distances that had previously required months or years for message delivery. The system operated through a network of relay stations positioned at intervals of approximately 25 miles along major routes, each station maintaining fresh horses and riders capable of carrying imperial messages at unprecedented speeds. A message from Karakorum could reach European territories in 6 weeks, while communications to Chinese territories required only 3 weeks. Yam stations provided not only communication services, but also accommodation and logistical support for authorized travelers, including merchants carrying imperial trading permits. These facilities offered secure lodging, fresh pack animals, and route information that significantly reduced the costs and risks associated with long-distance travel. The standardization of services across the entire Yam network created predictable travel conditions that enabled merchants to plan complex trading expeditions with greater confidence in their ability to complete planned itineraries. The integration of conquered territories into a unified administrative system required the development of standardized currency and measurement systems that could facilitate commercial transactions across culturally diverse regions. Mongol administrators adopted silver as the primary medium of exchange for high-value transactions while permitting local currencies to continue circulating for smaller commercial activities. This dual currency system provided flexibility for different types of commercial transactions while establishing imperial control over major financial flows. Mongol trade policies actively encouraged long-distance commerce through tax reductions, infrastructure investments, and diplomatic arrangements that eliminated many of the obstacles that had previously complicated international trade. The Mongols reduced or eliminated customs duties on goods transiting their territories, recognizing that increased trade volumes would generate greater total revenue than high taxation rates that discouraged commercial activities. This approach proved remarkably successful in attracting merchants from across Eurasia to utilize Mongol-controlled trade routes. The Pax Mongolica period, extending roughly from 1260 to 1350 AD, created unprecedented conditions for cultural exchange and technological transmission across Eurasia. The political stability and commercial security provided by unified Mongol administration enabled scholars, artisans, and religious teachers to travel safely across vast distances, carrying ideas and techniques that would have remained isolated within their regions of origin under previous political conditions. This period witnessed accelerated transmission of innovations in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and various crafts that enriched civilizations across the entire Eurasian continent. Chinese technological knowledge reached Middle Eastern and European territories during this period through systematic Mongol policies that relocated skilled craftsmen and scholars to regions where their expertise could contribute to imperial objectives. Chinese engineers working on Middle Eastern irrigation projects introduced new techniques for water management and agricultural development, while Chinese medical practitioners shared knowledge of surgical procedures and pharmaceutical preparations that enhanced medical capabilities in Islamic territories. The westward transmission of gunpowder technology during the Mongol period revolutionized military capabilities across Eurasia, though the full implications of this technological transfer would not become apparent until the 14th and 15th centuries. Mongol armies utilized Chinese explosive devices and early firearms in their European campaigns, introducing these technologies to regions that quickly recognized their military potential and began developing their own weapons production capabilities. Islamic astronomical and mathematical knowledge traveled eastward through Mongol networks, reaching Chinese scholars who incorporated Islamic computational techniques and observational methods into their own scientific traditions. The Yuan dynasty's Astronomical Bureau employed Islamic astronomers who brought sophisticated mathematical tools and theoretical frameworks that enhanced Chinese astronomical capabilities. These exchanges created hybrid scientific traditions that combined the best elements of different cultural approaches to understanding natural phenomena. The establishment of Mongol capitals at Karakorum and later Khanbalik created new centres for international commerce that attracted merchants from across the known world. These cities featured markets where goods from Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, China and India could be found in close proximity, creating commercial opportunities that had never previously existed. The cosmopolitan character of these Mongol capitals facilitated cultural exchanges and business relationships that transcended traditional ethnic and religious boundaries. Marco Polo's journey to China between 1271 and 1295 AD occurred during the height of Mongol power, when the political stability and commercial infrastructure created by Mongol administration made such extended travel both possible and profitable. Polo's family belonged to a network of Venetian merchants who had recognized the commercial opportunities created by Mongol unification of Eurasian trade routes. Their success in establishing trading relationships with Mongol authorities demonstrated the practical benefits of the Pax Mongolica for European commercial expansion. The detailed observations recorded in Marco Polo's account provide invaluable documentation of commercial conditions, urban development, and cultural practices throughout the Mongol Empire during the late 13th century. His descriptions of Chinese cities, manufacturing techniques, and commercial practices introduced European audiences to economic possibilities that would influence European exploration and trade policies for centuries. Polo's account of paper money usage in China particularly impressed European readers who had never encountered government-issued currency not backed by precious metals. Other European travellers during the Mongol period, including Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, William of Rubruck, and various merchants whose accounts have been preserved in fragmentary form, provide additional evidence for the unprecedented level of East-West contact that characterized this era. These travellers consistently reported on the safety and efficiency of travel under Mongol protection, contrasting their experiences favourably with the dangers and uncertainties that had characterized earlier attempts at long-distance travel. The Mongol Empire's religious tolerance policies created conditions that facilitated the spread of various religious traditions across Eurasia. Nestorian Christianity reached China in unprecedented numbers during the Mongol period, while Islamic scholars and religious teachers gained access to Chinese territories that had previously been largely closed to foreign religious influences. Buddhist monasteries in Central Asian territories received protection and support from Mongol administrators, enabling them to maintain their educational and cultural functions despite the political upheavals of the conquest period. Mongol patronage of international scholarship created intellectual communities that transcended traditional cultural boundaries. The court at Khanbalik employed scholars from across Eurasia, creating an environment where Chinese, Islamic, European, and Central Asian intellectual traditions could interact and influence each other. These scholarly exchanges produced innovations in various fields that combined insights from different cultural traditions in ways that would not have been possible without Mongol political unification. The development of international diplomatic practices during the Mongol period established precedents for cross-cultural communication and negotiation that influenced diplomatic relations for centuries. Mongol diplomatic missions to European courts, Islamic territories, and various Asian kingdoms created regular channels for political communication that facilitated not only governmental relationships, but also commercial and cultural exchanges between distant regions. Mongol military campaigns in Eastern Europe introduced European populations to Asian military technologies, organizational methods, and strategic concepts that influenced European military development. European observers of Mongol military operations learned lessons about logistics, communication, and battlefield coordination that they adapted to their own military systems. The Mongol emphasis on intelligence gathering and strategic planning particularly impressed European military leaders who had previously relied primarily on traditional feudal military approaches. The fragmentation of the Mongol Empire into separate khanates during the late 13th and early 14th centuries initially disrupted some of the unified administrative systems that had facilitated long-distance trade, but the individual khanates generally maintained policies that supported commercial activities within their respective territories. The Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Eastern Europe, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia each developed administrative systems that preserved many of the commercial advantages created by unified Mongol rule, while adapting to local conditions and requirements. The Yuan dynasty's policies toward foreign merchants demonstrated continued Mongol commitment to international trade promotion, despite the political separation from other Mongol territories. Kublai Khan's administration maintained the infrastructure and legal frameworks that supported long-distance commerce, while developing new initiatives designed to attract foreign traders to Chinese territories. The construction of new ports, the expansion of canal systems, and the standardization of commercial regulations created conditions that enabled Chinese trade to reach unprecedented levels during the Yuan period. The gradual dissolution of Mongol unity during the late 13th and early 14th centuries coincided with devastating demographic catastrophes that fundamentally altered the economic foundation supporting Silk Road commerce. The Black Death, which swept across Eurasian trade networks between 1347 and 1351 AD, followed established commercial routes with terrifying efficiency, transforming the very pathways that had facilitated centuries of prosperity into conduits for unprecedented mortality. The plague's origins in Central Asian rodent populations meant that trading cities along traditional Silk Road routes experienced some of the highest death rates, with contemporary accounts describing the complete abandonment of entire commercial districts in cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar. The demographic collapse in Central Asian trading centres disrupted the intricate networks of commercial relationships, specialised knowledge, and financial arrangements that had sustained long-distance overland trade. Merchant families who had maintained trading partnerships across multiple generations found their operations crippled by the loss of experienced traders, local contacts, and the specialized linguistic and cultural knowledge necessary for navigating complex international transactions. The Hawala banking system, which had depended on personal relationships and reputation networks spanning thousands of miles, collapsed in many regions as key participants succumbed to disease or fled to safer territories. Surviving merchants discovered that the infrastructure supporting overland trade had deteriorated dramatically during the plague years. Caravanserais that had provided essential services for travelling merchants stood empty or had been converted to other purposes, while the specialised craftsmen who had maintained pack animals, repaired equipment, and provided route guidance had either died or abandoned their trades. The knowledge of seasonal travel conditions, water sources, and safe passage routes that had been accumulated over centuries of commercial experience was lost as experienced guides and caravan leaders perished without passing their expertise to successors. The political fragmentation that followed the collapse of unified Mongol administration created additional obstacles for merchants attempting to rebuild overland trading networks. The Yuan dynasty's fall in 1368 AD and replacement by the Ming dynasty marked the end of the cosmopolitan, trade-friendly policies that had characterized Mongol rule in China. The new Ming administration, led by Emperor Hongwu, implemented isolationist policies that severely restricted foreign merchant access to Chinese territories and eliminated many of the legal protections and commercial privileges that had attracted international traders to Chinese markets. Ming officials viewed foreign merchants with suspicion, considering them potential security threats who might provide intelligence to hostile powers or introduce destabilizing foreign influences into Chinese society. The tributary system that replaced open commercial relationships required foreign traders to obtain official permits, submit to extensive bureaucratic procedures, and conduct business only through government-approved channels. These restrictions dramatically increased the costs and uncertainties associated with trading with China, making overland routes less attractive compared to emerging maritime alternatives. The Chagatai Khanate's fragmentation into competing successor states created a patchwork of conflicting authorities along Central Asian trade routes, each imposing its own taxation systems, legal requirements, and security arrangements. Merchants travelling from China to Middle Eastern markets now faced multiple border crossings, currency exchanges, and diplomatic negotiations that had been unnecessary during the period of unified Mongol administration. The absence of standardized commercial law meant that contractual disputes could not be resolved through consistent legal procedures, while the lack of coordinated security arrangements left merchant caravans vulnerable to banditry and local conflicts. Tamerlane's campaigns during the late 14th century brought temporary political unification to much of Central Asia, but his military methods caused additional damage to the urban centres and agricultural systems that supported trade route operations. While Tamerlane's court at Samarkand became a centre for artistic and intellectual activity, his frequent military campaigns disrupted commercial activities throughout the region. The enormous resources devoted to military operations reduced the capital available for commercial investment, while the constant threat of warfare made long-term business planning extremely difficult. The rise of the Ottoman Empire in Anatolia and the Balkans created new political dynamics that affected traditional overland trade routes connecting Asia with European markets. Ottoman control over Constantinople after 1453 AD gave them significant influence over trade between Asia and Europe, but Ottoman policies toward long-distance commerce reflected different priorities from those of earlier powers that had facilitated Silk Road trade. The Ottomans focused primarily on controlling and taxing existing trade flows, rather than promoting expanded commercial activities, leading to increased costs for merchants using traditional overland routes. Ottoman taxation policies imposed substantial customs duties on goods transiting their territories, while their administrative systems created bureaucratic obstacles that delayed merchant caravans and increased operational costs. The Ottomans also implemented currency controls that complicated international financial transactions, requiring merchants to exchange currencies at official rates that often differed significantly from market values. These policies made overland routes through Ottoman territories less competitive compared to maritime alternatives that could bypass Ottoman control entirely. The Portuguese exploration of maritime routes around Africa represented the most significant challenge to traditional overland Silk Road networks. Vasco da Gama's successful voyage to India in 1497 to 1499 AD demonstrated that European merchants could reach Asian markets without relying on the complex overland networks that had previously been essential for East-West trade. The Portuguese discovery that maritime routes could deliver Asian goods to European markets at lower costs and with greater reliability marked the beginning of the end for traditional Silk Road commerce. Portuguese maritime technology, including improved ship design, navigation instruments, and sailing techniques, enabled them to transport larger cargo volumes over greater distances than had been possible with overland caravans. A single Portuguese carrack could carry as much silk as dozens of camel caravans, while the maritime route from Lisbon to Goa required only 6 to 8 months compared to the year or more needed for overland travel from China to European markets. The reduced transportation time meant that perishable goods could reach markets in better condition, while the lower transportation costs enabled Portuguese merchants to offer competitive prices for Asian products. The establishment of Portuguese trading posts at Goa, Malacca, and Macau created new commercial networks that competed directly with traditional Silk Road routes. These maritime networks offered several advantages over overland alternatives, including more reliable scheduling, reduced security risks, and simplified administrative procedures. Portuguese merchants could conduct business through their own colonial administrators rather than negotiating with multiple foreign authorities, while Portuguese naval power provided security that was often more effective than the protection arrangements available along overland routes. The Spanish establishment of trans-Pacific trade routes connecting the Philippines with Mexico created additional maritime alternatives to traditional overland networks. The Manila-Acapulco galleon trade, beginning in 1565 AD, enabled Asian goods to reach American and European markets through Pacific and Atlantic maritime routes that completely bypassed traditional Silk Road territories. Chinese silk, porcelain, and spices could now reach European consumers through Spanish colonial networks that offered competitive prices and reliable delivery schedules. The Dutch entry into Asian maritime trade during the early 17th century intensified competition with overland routes through their development of highly efficient commercial operations that maximized profits while minimizing costs. The Dutch East India Company's systematic approach to Asian trade included innovations in shipping technology, commercial organization, and financial management that set new standards for international commerce. Dutch merchants could offer Asian goods in European markets at prices that made overland alternatives economically unviable for most categories of trade. Chinese maritime exploration under the Ming dynasty initially appeared to offer opportunities for integrating traditional overland networks with new maritime alternatives. Admiral Zheng, his 7 major expeditions between 1405 and 1433 AD, demonstrated Chinese capabilities in long-distance maritime navigation and established diplomatic relationships with rulers throughout Southeast Asia, India, and the Western Indian Ocean. These expeditions utilized massive treasure fleets that included ships far larger than any European vessels of the period, carrying crews numbering in the thousands and cargo capacities that dwarfed contemporary European maritime operations. Zheng He's expeditions served multiple purposes beyond simple exploration, including diplomatic missions designed to establish Chinese influence throughout the Indian Ocean region, commercial activities that sought new markets for Chinese products, and technological demonstrations that showcased Chinese maritime capabilities to foreign rulers. The expeditions established Chinese bases at strategic locations, including Malacca, Colombo, and Hormuz, creating a network of Chinese-controlled ports that could have supported expanded maritime trade operations. The treasure fleets carried substantial quantities of Chinese silk, porcelain, tea, and manufactured goods that they traded for local products including spices, precious stones, exotic woods, and various luxury items valued in Chinese markets. These trading activities demonstrated the commercial potential of maritime routes connecting China with Indian Ocean markets, while the diplomatic relationships established during the expeditions created political foundations that could have supported expanded Chinese maritime commerce. However, the Ming dynasty's decision to abandon large-scale maritime expeditions after 1433 AD reflected changing priorities that favoured continental defence over maritime expansion. The growing threat from northern nomadic groups, particularly the resurgent Mongol Confederation under Asen Khan, required enormous military resources that the imperial government could not simultaneously devote to both maritime exploration and continental defence. The costs associated with maintaining large naval fleets and overseas bases appeared increasingly difficult to justify when faced with immediate security threats along China's northern borders. The abandonment of Zheng He's maritime program marked a crucial turning point in global trade development, as Chinese withdrawal from Indian Ocean commerce created opportunities that European maritime powers quickly exploited. Had China continued its maritime expansion, the development of global trade networks might have proceeded very differently, potentially maintaining greater balance between overland and maritime commercial systems. Instead, Chinese maritime withdrawal enabled European powers to establish dominant positions in Asian maritime trade that gradually undermined the economic foundation supporting traditional overland routes. The Ming dynasty's implementation of the hygiene maritime prohibition policy further reduced Chinese participation in international maritime commerce, restricting Chinese merchants' ability to engage in overseas trade and limiting foreign access to Chinese ports. These policies were designed to prevent coastal piracy and reduce security threats from maritime sources, but they also eliminated many of the commercial opportunities that might have enabled traditional trading centres to adapt to changing global economic conditions. Chinese domestic policies during the Ming period reflected a fundamental shift away from the cosmopolitan outlook that had characterized earlier dynasties' approaches to international commerce. The Ming emphasis on agricultural self-sufficiency and cultural homogeneity created an environment that was less receptive to foreign merchants and international commercial relationships. These policy changes reduced demand for many of the luxury goods that had traditionally moved along Silk Road networks, while limiting Chinese merchants' ability to participate in emerging global trading systems. The development of new overland routes connecting Russia with China through Siberian territories offered some alternatives to traditional Central Asian pathways, but these northern routes faced severe geographical and climatic obstacles that limited their commercial potential. The extreme cold, vast distances, and sparse population of Siberian territories made these routes suitable primarily for high-value, low-volume trade rather than the diverse commercial activities that had characterized traditional Silk Road networks. Russian expansion into Siberian territories during the 16th and 17th centuries created political conditions that enabled some overland trade between European and Chinese markets to continue despite the decline of traditional Central Asian routes. However, Russian commercial policies focused primarily on fur trading and resource extraction, rather than facilitating transit trade between other regions. The Russian approach to Siberian commerce emphasized state control and monopolistic practices that limited opportunities for independent merchants and reduced the commercial flexibility that had been essential for traditional Silk Road operations. The transformation of Central Asian political structures during the 15th and 16th centuries created additional obstacles for traditional trade route operations. The rise of the Uzbek Khanates, Safavid Persia, and Mughal India established new political boundaries and administrative systems that often conflicted with the commercial networks that had developed during earlier periods. These new political entities implemented their own commercial policies, taxation systems, and legal frameworks that frequently disrupted established trading relationships and created new barriers to long-distance commerce. The Safavid Empire's establishment in Persia during the early 16th century initially offered some hope for reviving overland trade through Persian territories, as Safavid rulers recognized the economic benefits of international commerce. However, the ongoing conflicts between Safavid Persia and the Ottoman Empire created unstable conditions along traditional trade routes that made commercial operations extremely risky. The frequent warfare between these two powers disrupted transportation networks, destroyed commercial infrastructure, and created political uncertainties that discouraged long-term commercial investment. The gradual decline of traditional Silk Road cities reflected the broader economic changes that were undermining overland trade networks. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar, which had prospered for centuries as commercial centres, experienced population decline, reduced economic activity, and deteriorating infrastructure as trade volumes decreased. The specialised commercial knowledge, craft production capabilities, and cultural institutions that had made these cities attractive to international merchants gradually disappeared as economic opportunities shifted to maritime-oriented centres. The transformation of global trade patterns during this period represented more than simple substitution of maritime routes for overland alternatives. The new maritime networks enabled different types of commercial relationships, supported different categories of goods, and created different patterns of cultural exchange than had characterized traditional overland systems. While maritime routes proved more efficient for transporting bulk commodities and standardized manufactured goods, they offered fewer opportunities for the complex cultural interactions and technological exchanges that had enriched civilizations along traditional Silk Road networks. The collapse of traditional Silk Road networks during the 15th and 16th centuries created a political and economic vacuum across Central Asia that emerging powers quickly moved to fill. Russian expansion into Siberia, beginning with Yermak Timofeyevich's conquest of the Sibir Khanate in 1582, represented the most systematic attempt to establish new overland trade connections between European and Asian markets. Unlike the gradual commercial development that had characterized earlier Silk Road evolution, Russian expansion proceeded through deliberate military conquest, followed by administrative colonization, designed to extract maximum economic benefit from newly acquired territories. The Russian approach to Siberian colonization differed fundamentally from earlier patterns of Central Asian political development. Where traditional Silk Road cities had emerged organically around natural geographical advantages and commercial opportunities, Russian settlements in Siberia were established according to strategic plans that prioritized military control and resource extraction over commercial facilitation. The construction of fortified outposts at regular intervals along major rivers created a network of administrative centres that could enforce Russian authority while providing bases for further territorial expansion. Russian military technology provided decisive advantages in conquering Siberian territories, particularly their use of firearms against indigenous populations who possessed primarily traditional weapons. The matchlock muskets and small cannons employed by Russian forces proved devastatingly effective against the leather armour and wooden shields traditionally used by Siberian warriors. However, the extreme climate and vast distances of Siberian territories created logistical challenges that forced Russian commanders to adapt their military methods to local conditions. The Cossack military formations that spearheaded Russian expansion into Siberia combined traditional Russian military organisation with adaptations borrowed from steppe nomadic traditions. These semi-independent warrior communities possessed the mobility and self-sufficiency necessary for operating in Siberian wilderness conditions. while their military effectiveness enabled small Russian forces to control vast territories inhabited by much larger indigenous populations. The Cossacks' familiarity with river navigation proved particularly valuable, as Siberian river systems provided the primary transportation routes connecting scattered settlements across thousands of miles. Russian fur trading operations in Siberia created the first systematic economic exploitation of these territories, establishing collection systems that channeled valuable pelts toward European markets through Moscow and other Western Russian cities. The Yasuk tribute system required indigenous communities to provide specified quantities of fur pelts to Russian administrators, creating steady revenue streams that helped finance further territorial expansion. Sable, ermine, and other high-value furs from Siberian sources commanded premium prices in European markets, generating profits that justify the enormous costs associated with maintaining Russian administration across such vast and inhospitable territories. The development of the Trans-Siberian route connecting Moscow with Chinese territories required overcoming geographical obstacles that had prevented earlier attempts at establishing reliable overland connections between European and East Asian markets. The route's northern path avoided many of the political complications that had disrupted traditional Central Asian networks, but it presented severe climatic challenges that limited travel to specific seasons and required specialized equipment and techniques for surviving extreme cold conditions. Russian diplomatic relations with China developed gradually through border negotiations that established the legal framework for commercial exchanges between the two empires. The Treaty of Nachinsk in 1689 resolved territorial disputes along the Amur River while creating the first formal diplomatic agreement between Russia and China. This treaty established precedents for Russian-Chinese commercial relationships that would influence trade development for the next 2 centuries, including provisions for diplomatic missions, border crossing procedures, and dispute resolution mechanisms. The establishment of Kyakhta as the primary trading post for Russian-Chinese commerce created a new type of commercial centre that differed significantly from traditional Silk Road cities. Located on the Russian-Chinese border, Kyakhta functioned as a controlled interface between 2 imperial systems rather than an independent commercial hub. Russian and Chinese merchants conducted business under strict governmental supervision, with officials from both empires monitoring transactions and collecting custom duties according to predetermined agreements. Trade goods flowing through Kyakhta reflected the different economic priorities that characterized Russian-Chinese commercial relationships compared to earlier Silk Road networks. Russian merchants primarily sought Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, while offering furs, leather goods, and European manufactured products in exchange. The volume and variety of goods moving through Kyakhta remained limited compared to the diverse commercial activities that had characterized traditional Silk Road cities during their peak periods, but the regularity and security of these exchanges provided reliable revenue for both governments. The tea trade became the dominant component of Russian-Chinese commerce, with Russian consumption of Chinese tea growing dramatically during the 17th and 18th centuries. Russian merchants developed specialized techniques for transporting tea across Siberian territories without significant deterioration in quality, including the use of specially designed containers and careful attention to moisture control during long overland journeys. The popularity of tea in Russian society created steady demand that supported regular commercial expeditions despite the enormous distances and harsh conditions involved. Chinese policies toward Russian trade reflected the broader changes in Chinese attitudes toward foreign commerce that had emerged during the Ming and early Qing periods. Chinese officials viewed Russian merchants as representatives of a neighbouring empire rather than independent commercial operators, leading to diplomatic protocols that emphasized governmental control over private commercial initiative. These policies limited the scope of Russian-Chinese trade, but provided stability and predictability that enabled sustained commercial relationships over extended periods. The rise of the Safavid Empire in Persia during the early 16th century created new political conditions that affected traditional trade routes connecting Central Asia with Middle Eastern and European markets. Shah Ismail's establishment of Safavid control over Persian territories in 1501 brought political unification to regions that had been fragmented among competing local rulers for over a century. The Safavid administrative system combined Persian bureaucratic traditions with Turkmen military organization, creating governmental structures capable of managing the complex commercial relationships that had traditionally supported Persian participation in long-distance trade. Safavid economic policies actively encouraged commercial development through infrastructure investments and legal reforms designed to attract merchants and stimulate trade activities. Shah Abbas I's construction projects during the early 17th century included new roads, bridges and caravanserais that improved transportation conditions along routes connecting Persian territories with Central Asian and Indian markets. The new Safavid capital at Isfahan became a major commercial centre that attracted merchants from across the Islamic world, creating market opportunities that partially compensated for the decline of traditional Central Asian trading cities. The Safavid silk industry represented the most successful adaptation of traditional Silk Road production techniques to early modern economic conditions. Persian silk producers developed new cultivation methods and processing techniques that enabled them to compete effectively with Chinese silk in Middle Eastern and European markets. The establishment of silk production centres in Mazandaran and Gilan provinces created integrated manufacturing systems that controlled all stages of production from silkworm cultivation through final textile manufacturing. Persian carpet production during the Safavid period achieved unprecedented levels of artistic sophistication and technical excellence, creating luxury goods that commanded premium prices in international markets. The court workshops at Isfahan and Kashan employed hundreds of skilled weavers who produced carpets featuring complex designs and superior materials that established Persian carpets as the most prestigious floor coverings available to wealthy consumers throughout Europe and Asia. These carpet workshops maintained direct commercial relationships with international merchants, bypassing traditional intermediary networks that had characterized earlier periods of Persian craft production. Safavid diplomatic relationships with European powers created new opportunities for Persian participation in emerging global trade networks. Portuguese, Dutch and English merchants established trading posts in Persian territories, offering access to maritime commercial networks that connected Persian producers with European and colonial markets. These relationships enabled Persian merchants to diversify their commercial activities beyond traditional overland routes, while maintaining their established connections with Central Asian and Indian trading partners. The Ottoman Empire's expansion during the 16th century created the largest Islamic political entity since the Abbasid Caliphate, controlling territories that included crucial segments of traditional Silk Road networks. Ottoman administration of former Byzantine Mamluk and various Anatolian territories required integrating diverse populations and economic systems into a unified imperial structure. The Ottoman approach to managing this diversity emphasized practical accommodation of local customs and commercial practices rather than wholesale imposition of uniform administrative systems. Ottoman control over Constantinople and other strategic cities along traditional east-west trade routes provided them with significant influence over commercial flows between Asian and European markets. However, Ottoman policies toward long-distance trade reflected different priorities from those of earlier powers that had actively promoted Silk Road commerce. The Ottomans focused primarily on extracting revenue from existing trade flows through taxation and regulation rather than investing in infrastructure improvements or commercial promotion that might have expanded trade volumes. The Devshirme system of recruiting administrative personnel from Christian populations provided the Ottoman Empire with educated bureaucrats who possessed knowledge of local conditions and commercial practices in diverse territories. These administrators proved particularly valuable in managing the complex commercial relationships that characterized Ottoman territories, as they understood both imperial policies and local commercial customs. The system's emphasis on merit-based advancement created opportunities for talented individuals from various backgrounds to achieve influential positions within the imperial administration. Ottoman military technology and organization enabled them to maintain control over vast territories while projecting power across multiple frontiers simultaneously. The Janissary Corps provided the empire with professional infantry forces equipped with firearms and artillery, while the Ottoman navy dominated the eastern Mediterranean and challenged European maritime powers in the Indian Ocean. These military capabilities enabled the Ottomans to protect commercial activities within their territories while pursuing aggressive expansion policies that brought additional commercial centres under imperial control. The Mughal Empire's establishment in India during the early 16th century created new political conditions that affected traditional trade routes connecting Central Asian territories with Indian markets. Babur's conquest of the Delhi Sultanate in 1526 began a process of territorial expansion that would eventually bring most of the Indian subcontinent under unified political control for the first time since the Gupta Empire. The Mughal administrative system combined Central Asian military traditions with Persian bureaucratic methods and Indian commercial practices, creating governmental structures capable of managing the subcontinent's enormous population and complex economy. Mughal policies toward long-distance trade reflected the empire's Central Asian origins and continued connections with traditional Silk Road networks. The Mughal court maintained diplomatic relationships with Safavid Persia, Ottoman territories, and various Central Asian rulers, creating political conditions that facilitated commercial exchanges across traditional trade routes. Mughal merchants continued to participate in overland trade networks even as maritime alternatives became increasingly important for Indian Ocean commerce. The development of Mughal textile production, particularly cotton fabrics and luxury textiles, created new categories of trade goods that found markets throughout Asia and eventually Europe. Mughal workshops produced cotton textiles of exceptional quality and distinctive designs that appealed to consumers across diverse cultural contexts. The integration of Indian cotton production with traditional silk manufacturing techniques created hybrid textiles that combine the durability and comfort of cotton with the luxury appearance associated with silk products. Mughal urban development during the 16th and 17th centuries created new commercial centres that rivaled traditional Silk Road cities in their cosmopolitan character and economic sophistication. Cities like Delhi, Agra and Lahore attracted merchants from across Asia, creating market environments where goods from China, Central Asia, Persia and the Ottoman Empire could be found alongside Indian products. These cities developed specialised commercial districts that catered to different categories of trade, from bulk commodity exchanges to luxury goods markets serving elite consumers. The Mughal monetary system, based on silver currency with standardised weights and purity levels, facilitated commercial transactions across the empire's vast territories while providing a stable medium of exchange for international trade. Mughal silver coins gained acceptance in Central Asian markets, creating currency networks that connected Indian commercial centres with traditional Silk Road trading systems. The empire's access to silver from various sources, including European colonial imports, enabled Mughal merchants to participate effectively in international commercial relationships that required precious metal payments. Regional trade networks continued operating throughout Central Asia despite the decline of transcontinental commerce, adapting to changed political and economic conditions while maintaining many traditional commercial practices. The tea horse trade between Chinese territories and Tibetan regions represented one of the most durable of these regional systems, continuing to operate under various political arrangements from the Tang dynasty through the Qing period. This trade relationship reflected the complementary economic needs of agricultural Chinese communities and nomadic Tibetan populations, creating mutual dependencies that transcended political changes. Chinese tea producers in Sichuan and other southwestern provinces developed specialized techniques for processing tea specifically for Tibetan markets, creating compressed tea bricks that could survive long-distance transportation while meeting Tibetan preferences for tea preparation and consumption. These tea bricks became a standardized medium of exchange in Tibetan territories, functioning as both commodity and currency in commercial transactions. The standardization of tea brick weights and quality levels created predictable value relationships that facilitated commercial planning and reduced disputes between trading partners. Tibetan horse breeding operations supplied Chinese military forces with cavalry mounts that possessed the endurance and sure-footedness necessary for operating in mountainous terrain and harsh climatic conditions. The selective breeding techniques developed by Tibetan herders produced horses with distinctive characteristics that made them particularly valuable for Chinese frontier defense operations. The Chinese government's willingness to pay premium prices for high-quality Tibetan horses created steady demand that supported extensive pastoral operations throughout Tibetan territories. The administrative arrangements governing the tea horse trade evolved over time to accommodate changing political conditions, while maintaining the essential commercial relationships that benefited both Chinese and Tibetan communities. Chinese officials established specialized bureaus responsible for managing tea horse exchanges, including quality control procedures, price negotiations, and dispute resolution mechanisms. These administrative systems provided stability and predictability that enabled long-term commercial planning despite the political uncertainties that characterized Chinese-Tibetan relationships during various historical periods. Central Asian bazaar systems continued functioning as regional commercial centers even after the decline of transcontinental trade routes, adapting their operations to serve local and regional markets rather than international commercial networks. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Tashkent maintained commercial districts that facilitated trade between nomadic pastoral communities and settled agricultural populations, providing essential services for regional economic development. These bazaars specialized in goods that reflected local production capabilities and consumption patterns, including livestock, agricultural products, textiles, and various manufactured items produced by local craftsmen. The organization of Central Asian bazaars reflected centuries of commercial experience and cultural adaptation to local conditions. Specialized sections for different categories of goods enabled efficient price discovery and quality comparison, while established procedures for dispute resolution and contract enforcement provided security for commercial transactions. The integration of commercial activities with social and cultural functions made these bazaars important community centers that served multiple purposes beyond simple economic exchange. European colonial expansion in Asian territories during the 17th and 18th centuries gradually undermined traditional trade patterns through the establishment of maritime commercial networks that offered more efficient alternatives to overland routes. The Dutch East India Company's systematic approach to Asian trade created integrated commercial operations that controlled production, transportation, and marketing functions across multiple territories. This vertical integration enabled Dutch merchants to offer competitive prices while maintaining quality control standards that traditional overland networks could not match. English commercial expansion in Indian territories, culminating in the East India Company's political control over much of the subcontinent, eliminated many of the traditional commercial relationships that had connected Indian markets with Central Asian trade networks. English policies toward Indian textile production, designed to support British manufacturing interests, disrupted traditional craft production systems while redirecting Indian raw materials toward European markets. These changes reduced demand for many of the goods that had traditionally moved along overland trade routes, while limiting Indian merchants' ability to participate in traditional commercial networks. The transformation of global trade patterns during this period created new economic relationships that gradually replaced traditional Silk Road networks with maritime-based commercial systems. However, the regional trade networks that had developed as components of larger transcontinental systems continued operating on reduced scales, adapting to changed conditions while preserving many of the commercial practices and cultural traditions that had characterized Silk Road civilization for over a millennium. The weakening of traditional Central Asian political structures during the early 19th century created unprecedented opportunities for European imperial expansion into territories that had remained largely independent for centuries. The fragmentation of the Uzbek Khanates, the decline of Safavid successor states in Persia, and the Qing dynasty's tenuous control over its western territories left vast regions of Central Asia vulnerable to foreign intervention. Into this power vacuum stepped two expanding empires whose competition would fundamentally reshape the political geography of the ancient Silk Road territories. The British East India Company's consolidation of control over the Indian subcontinent during the late 18th and early 19th centuries provided the foundation for northward expansion towards Central Asian territories. Company officials, particularly those stationed in frontier regions like the Punjab and the northwest frontier, began developing intelligence networks that extended far beyond the formal boundaries of British India. These networks, composed of merchants, explorers, and local informants, gathered detailed information about political conditions, military capabilities, and economic opportunities in Afghanistan, Central Asia, and the approaches to Russian territories. British strategic thinking regarding Central Asia reflected deep concerns about Russian expansion toward India, concerns that would shape imperial policy for nearly a century. The spectre of Russian forces advancing through Central Asian territories toward the vulnerable northern frontiers of British India haunted British strategic planners, who envisioned nightmare scenarios of coordinated Russian-Persian attacks that could threaten the jewel of the British Empire. These fears, often exaggerated but never entirely unfounded, drove British officials to pursue increasingly aggressive policies designed to create buffer zones and spheres of influence that would prevent Russian forces from approaching Indian territories. Russian expansion into Central Asia proceeded through a combination of military conquest, diplomatic pressure, and economic penetration that systematically eliminated the independence of traditional Silk Road cities. The conquest of the Kazakh steppes during the early 19th century provided Russia with strategic bases for further advances toward the settled oasis cities that controlled crucial segments of traditional trade routes. Russian military commanders developed specialized techniques for desert warfare, including the use of camel corps and mobile artillery units that could operate effectively in the harsh climatic conditions of Central Asian territories. The siege and capture of Khiva in 1873 demonstrated the effectiveness of Russian military methods adapted to Central Asian conditions. General Konstantin Kaufmann's expeditionary force employed a combination of conventional infantry assault and siege artillery bombardment that overwhelmed the city's traditional fortifications. The capture involved coordinated attacks from multiple directions, with Russian engineers constructing siege works that enabled artillery to breach the ancient walls that had protected Khiva for centuries. The systematic nature of the assault, involving precise timing and coordination between different military units, showcased the technological and organizational advantages that European armies possessed over traditional Central Asian forces. The fall of Khiva sent shockwaves throughout Central Asia, as other regional rulers recognized that their traditional defensive methods could not withstand modern European military capabilities. The Khanate of Bukhara, faced with the prospect of similar treatment, negotiated a protectorate agreement that preserved nominal independence while accepting Russian control over foreign relations and military affairs. This arrangement became a model for Russian expansion throughout Central Asia, combining the efficiency of direct control with the political convenience of maintaining traditional ruling structures. Russian administration of conquered Central Asian territories reflected a pragmatic approach that balanced imperial control with accommodation of local customs and commercial practices. Russian officials recognized that the economic value of these territories depended largely on maintaining the commercial networks and craft production systems that had developed over centuries. Rather than imposing wholesale changes that might disrupt established economic relationships, Russian administrators often preserved traditional market structures while inserting themselves into existing commercial networks as regulators and tax collectors. The construction of the Trans-Caspian Railway, beginning in 1879, represented the most significant infrastructure project in Central Asian history since the original development of Silk Road networks. This railway, extending from the Caspian seaport of Krasnovodsk to Samarkand and eventually to Tashkent, created the first mechanized transportation system capable of moving large quantities of goods and passengers across Central Asian territories with unprecedented speed and reliability. The railway's completion transformed the economic geography of the region by making European manufactured goods available in Central Asian markets at competitive prices while enabling Central Asian products to reach European consumers more efficiently than ever before. The railway construction process required overcoming enormous engineering challenges posed by desert terrain, extreme temperatures, and the absence of local materials and skilled labour. Russian engineers imported workers from various parts of the empire, creating temporary construction camps that resembled military installations more than civilian settlements. The logistics of supplying these remote construction sites with food, water, building materials, and equipment required careful planning and substantial financial resources that demonstrated the Russian government's commitment to establishing permanent control over Central Asian territories. British responses to Russian railway construction reflected growing alarm about the strategic implications of improved Russian transportation capabilities in Central Asia. British military analysts recognized that the railway would enable Russia to deploy large military forces to Central Asian territories much more rapidly than had previously been possible, potentially threatening British positions in Afghanistan and northern India. These concerns drove British officials to pursue countermeasures, including their own infrastructure projects and diplomatic initiatives designed to limit Russian influence in regions considered vital to Indian security. The competition between British and Russian intelligence networks in Central Asia created an environment of constant espionage and counter-espionage that contemporary observers dubbed the Great Game. This competition involved not only professional intelligence officers, but also explorers, merchants, diplomats, and adventurers from both empires who gathered information about political conditions, military capabilities, and geographical features of territories that remained largely unmapped by European standards. The intelligence gathered through these networks influenced policy decisions in London and St. Petersburg that affected the lives of millions of people across Central Asia. British survey operations in Central Asian territories, conducted under the auspices of the Survey of India, produced the first accurate maps of regions that had been known to Europeans only through fragmentary accounts by medieval travellers. The Great Trigonometrical Survey's extension into Central Asian territories required extraordinary courage and skill from surveyors who worked in hostile environments while maintaining the secrecy necessary to avoid detection by suspicious local authorities. These surveyors, often working disguised as merchants or pilgrims, used ingenious techniques to measure distances and elevations while conducting their covert mapping operations. The pundits, as these native surveyors were known, represented one of the most remarkable intelligence operations in imperial history. These carefully trained individuals, recruited primarily from border regions of British India, could blend into local populations while conducting sophisticated geographical and political intelligence gathering. Their training included memorization techniques that enabled them to retain detailed information about routes, distances, political conditions, and military capabilities without maintaining written records that might compromise their missions if discovered. Russian archaeological expeditions to Central Asian territories during the late 19th century combined scientific research with intelligence gathering and political assertion of imperial claims. These expeditions, often funded by the Imperial Russian Geographical Society, conducted systematic excavations at sites like Samarkand, Merv, and various locations along traditional Silk Road routes. The archaeological work provided valuable scientific information about the history and culture of Central Asian civilizations, while also demonstrating Russian cultural and intellectual engagement with territories under their political control. The work of Russian archaeologist Alexander Cunningham at sites throughout Central Asia revealed the extraordinary artistic and cultural achievements of medieval Silk Road civilizations. Cunningham's excavations uncovered architectural remains, artistic objects, and documentary materials that provided unprecedented insight into the daily life, commercial practices, and cultural traditions of the peoples who had created and maintained the Silk Road networks. His meticulous documentation of archaeological findings created a scientific record that preserved knowledge of Central Asian heritage, even as political changes disrupted traditional cultural continuity. British archaeological expeditions, led by figures like Aurel Stein, conducted extensive explorations of sites in Chinese Turkestan and other regions accessible from British India. Stein's expeditions to the Taklamakan Desert and the Tarim Basin between 1900 and 1916 resulted in the discovery of extraordinary archaeological treasures that revolutionized understanding of Silk Road history and culture. His systematic excavation techniques and careful documentation of findings established new standards for archaeological work in Central Asian environments. Stein's discovery of the sealed library cave at Dunhuang in 1907 provided access to one of the most important collections of medieval manuscripts and documents ever found. The cave, sealed in the 11th century, contained over 40,000 documents in multiple languages and scripts that documented nearly every aspect of Silk Road civilization during its peak period. These materials included Buddhist texts, commercial contracts, official correspondence, literary works, and administrative documents that provided unprecedented insight into the complexity and sophistication of medieval Central Asian society. The removal of Dunhuang manuscripts and artifacts to European collections sparked controversies about cultural heritage and archaeological ethics that continue to influence international discussions about cultural property. Stein's acquisition of thousands of manuscripts, paintings, and textiles from Dunhuang for British collections was facilitated by payments to local monks who controlled access to the site. But the legitimacy of these transactions became increasingly questionable as nationalist movements in China began asserting claims to cultural patrimony. Paul Pelliot's French expedition to Central Asia, conducted simultaneously with Stein's work, employed different methods but achieved similarly significant results in documenting Silk Road heritage. Pelliot's linguistic expertise enabled him to read and evaluate manuscripts in their original languages, allowing him to select materials of particular historical and cultural significance. His work at Dunhuang and other sites resulted in the acquisition of important manuscript collections for French institutions, while contributing to scholarly understanding of Central Asian languages and literature. German expeditions to Central Asia, led by archaeologists like Albert von Lecoq, focused particularly on sites in the Tarim Basin, where German researchers conducted systematic excavations of Buddhist monasteries and associated settlements. Von Lecoq's work at sites like Bezeklik and Turfan uncovered wall paintings, sculptures, and architectural remains that documented the artistic achievements of Central Asian Buddhist communities during the medieval period. The German expeditions employed advanced photographic techniques that preserved visual records of archaeological discoveries with unprecedented accuracy and detail. The competition between European archaeological expeditions reflected broader patterns of imperial rivalry, while contributing to genuine advances in scientific understanding of Central Asian history and culture. Each national expedition sought to acquire the most important archaeological materials for their home institutions, while conducting research that would enhance their nation's scholarly reputation and cultural prestige. This competition sometimes led to hasty excavation methods and inadequate documentation, but it also accelerated the pace of archaeological discovery and increased European awareness of Central Asian cultural achievements. The documentation of Silk Road heritage through archaeological expeditions occurred at a crucial historical moment when traditional cultural patterns were being disrupted by political changes and modernization efforts. Many of the sites excavated by European archaeologists were already suffering from neglect, vandalism, and natural deterioration that threatened to destroy irreplaceable cultural materials. The archaeological work, despite its problematic aspects regarding cultural ownership, preserved knowledge and artifacts that might otherwise have been lost entirely. Local responses to European archaeological activities varied considerably depending on political conditions and cultural attitudes toward foreign research. In some cases, local authorities and religious leaders welcomed archaeological expeditions as sources of employment and economic activity that brought outside resources to remote regions. In other situations, local populations viewed foreign archaeological work with suspicion, seeing it as another form of imperial exploitation that removed valuable cultural materials from their traditional locations. The establishment of European colonial administrations in Central Asian territories created new legal and administrative frameworks that affected traditional commercial practices and cultural institutions. Russian administrative systems in Central Asia combined elements of traditional Russian provincial government with adaptations designed to accommodate local conditions and customs. Colonial officials often retained existing local administrators while inserting Russian supervisors who monitored their activities and ensured compliance with imperial policies. British administrative methods in frontier regions adjacent to Central Asia reflected lessons learned from governing diverse populations throughout the empire. The system of political agents and resident advisors enabled British officials to exercise indirect control over nominally independent territories while maintaining flexibility in responding to local political conditions. These arrangements often preserved traditional ruling structures while ensuring that important policy decisions aligned with British strategic interests. The transformation of ancient Silk Road cities under colonial administration proceeded through gradual modernization efforts that introduced European technologies and administrative methods while attempting to preserve economically valuable traditional practices. The construction of telegraph lines connecting major Central Asian cities with imperial capitals created communication capabilities that revolutionized administrative efficiency and commercial coordination. Messages that had previously required weeks or months to transmit could now be sent across thousands of miles in a matter of hours. Modern banking systems introduced by colonial administrations provided new financial services that gradually replaced traditional hawala networks and other informal financial arrangements. European banks established branches in major Central Asian cities, offering currency exchange, credit facilities, and international transfer services that facilitated trade with European markets. These modern financial institutions operated alongside traditional commercial practices, creating hybrid systems that combined European efficiency with local knowledge and relationships. The introduction of modern medical services in colonial territories brought European medical knowledge to populations that had previously relied primarily on traditional healing practices. Colonial medical officers established hospitals and clinics that provided treatment for diseases and injuries, while also conducting research on health conditions specific to Central Asian environments. The integration of European medical practices with traditional healing knowledge created new approaches to healthcare that combined the best elements of both systems. Educational reforms implemented by colonial administrations introduced European curricula and teaching methods while attempting to preserve valuable elements of traditional educational systems. The establishment of modern schools in major cities provided access to European languages, scientific knowledge, and technical skills that enabled local populations to participate more effectively in the modernising economy. These educational initiatives often faced resistance from traditional religious authorities who viewed European education as a threat to established cultural and religious values. The preservation of historical sites and cultural monuments under colonial administration reflected competing priorities between development needs and cultural conservation. Colonial officials recognised the historical and artistic value of ancient Silk Road monuments, while also facing practical pressures to utilise available land and resources for modern development projects. The decisions made during this period regarding which sites to preserve and which to allow deterioration or destruction would have lasting consequences for Central Asian cultural heritage. The construction of modern transportation infrastructure, including roads, railways and telegraph lines, often required decisions about routing that affected historical sites and traditional settlement patterns. Colonial engineers generally prioritised efficiency and cost considerations over historical preservation, leading to the destruction or alteration of some ancient sites while inadvertently protecting others through their remote locations. The long-term impact of these infrastructure decisions would continue to influence Central Asian development patterns well into the modern era. The documentation efforts undertaken by colonial administrators and researchers created extensive records of traditional practices, languages, and cultural institutions that were already beginning to change under the influence of modernization. These ethnographic and linguistic studies preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost as traditional ways of life adapted to new economic and political conditions. However, the colonial context of this documentation work also influenced how traditional cultures were interpreted and presented, often emphasizing aspects that supported colonial policy objectives while neglecting elements that contradicted European assumptions about civilization and progress. The archaeological expeditions and colonial documentation efforts of the early 20th century had inadvertently planted the seeds for a remarkable transformation in how the world would come to understand and romanticize the ancient Silk Road. As European scholars returned from Central Asian expeditions with manuscripts, artifacts, and photographs that revealed the extraordinary cultural achievements of medieval trading civilizations, a new narrative began emerging in academic circles and popular culture that would eventually reshape global perceptions of East-West connections. The publication of archaeological findings from sites like Dunhuang, Turfan and Samarkand during the 1910s and 1920s coincided with a period of growing Western fascination with Oriental cultures and ancient civilizations. European and American audiences, weary from the devastation of World War I and increasingly sceptical of industrial modernity, found themselves captivated by accounts of ancient trading cities where diverse cultures had coexisted peacefully and prospered through commercial cooperation. The Silk Road began to represent an idealized vision of international harmony and cultural exchange that contrasted sharply with the nationalist conflicts and imperial rivalries that had dominated recent history. German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen's coining of the term Seidenstrasse in 1877 had initially described a specific set of trade routes, but by the 1920s the concept had evolved into something far more expansive and romantic. Popular writers and journalists began using Silk Road to describe not just historical trade networks, but an entire philosophy of cultural openness and international cooperation. This romanticized interpretation often overlooked the harsh realities of ancient long-distance trade, including the dangers, exploitation and conflicts that had characterized much of Silk Road history, instead emphasizing the exotic appeal and cultural sophistication of ancient trading civilizations. The work of scholars like Paul Pelliot and Aurel Stein provided the factual foundation for this romanticization through their meticulous documentation of Silk Road archaeological sites and manuscript collections. Pelliot's linguistic expertise enabled him to translate and interpret documents that reveal the complexity of medieval Central Asian society, while Stein's photographic documentation preserved visual records of artistic achievements that demonstrated the high level of cultural development along ancient trade routes. Their scholarly publications reached academic audiences, but popular adaptations of their findings captured the imagination of much broader readerships. Swedish explorer Sven Hedin's expeditions to Central Asia during the early 20th century contributed significantly to popular fascination with Silk Road history through his dramatic accounts of desert exploration and archaeological discovery. Hedin's books, translated into multiple languages and widely distributed, combined rigorous geographical research with adventure narratives that appealed to general audiences. His descriptions of discovering ancient cities buried in desert sands, complete with preserved artifacts and architectural remains, created powerful images that would influence popular conceptions of Silk Road history for decades. The establishment of the Soviet Union fundamentally altered the political landscape of Central Asian territories that had been crucial components of historical Silk Road networks. Soviet policies towards Central Asian republics reflected complex tensions between modernization objectives and cultural preservation concerns. The Communist Party's commitment to rapid industrialization and social transformation often conflicted with traditional ways of life that had preserved elements of Silk Road cultural heritage. Soviet planners viewed many traditional practices as obstacles to progress that needed to be eliminated or fundamentally reformed. Soviet archaeological programs in Central Asia during the 1920s and 1930s approached Silk Road heritage from materialist historical perspectives that emphasized economic relationships and class conflicts rather than cultural exchange and international cooperation. Soviet archaeologists conducted extensive excavations at sites throughout Central Asia, producing valuable scientific documentation while interpreting their findings according to Marxist-Leninist theoretical frameworks. These interpretations often emphasize the exploitation of common people by merchant elites and ruling classes, rather than celebrating the cultural achievements that had emerged from commercial prosperity. The construction of modern transportation infrastructure in Soviet Central Asia created new connections between regions that had been isolated since the decline of traditional trade routes. The Turksib Railway, completed in 1931, linked Central Asian cotton-producing regions with industrial centres in Russia and Siberia, creating economic relationships that echoed some aspects of historical Silk Road commerce, while serving very different political and economic objectives. Soviet planners designed these transportation networks to facilitate resource extraction and industrial development rather than international trade and cultural exchange. World War II brought renewed attention to Central Asian territories as the Soviet Union relocated industrial facilities eastward to avoid German occupation. This wartime industrialization introduced modern manufacturing capabilities to regions that had previously remained largely agricultural, creating new economic foundations that would influence post-war development patterns. The war also demonstrated the strategic importance of Central Asian territories for connecting European Russia with Asian allies, reviving awareness of the geographical advantages that had made these regions crucial for historical trade networks. The emergence of independent nation-states in Central Asia following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 created new political conditions that enabled renewed interest in Silk Road heritage as a source of national identity and international recognition. Countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan began promoting their historical connections to Silk Road civilizations as part of efforts to establish distinct national cultures and attract international tourism and investment. This post-Soviet rediscovery of Silk Road heritage often emphasized the positive aspects of historical cultural exchange, while downplaying the conflicts and exploitation that had also characterized ancient trade networks. UNESCO's World Heritage Programme provided international recognition and preservation support for Silk Road archaeological sites beginning in the 1980s. The designation of sites like Samarkand, Bukhara and Khiva as World Heritage locations acknowledged their outstanding universal value while providing frameworks for conservation efforts that balance preservation needs with modern development pressures. These UNESCO designations also enhanced the international profile of Central Asian cultural heritage, contributing to growing global awareness of Silk Road history and its contemporary relevance. The development of international conservation projects at Silk Road sites during the 1990s and 2000s brought together expertise from multiple countries to address preservation challenges that exceeded the capabilities of individual nations. The Getty Conservation Institute's work at sites like the Mogao Caves at Dunhuang demonstrated how international cooperation could achieve the conservation objectives while respecting local sovereignty and cultural values. These projects also provided training opportunities for local conservation professionals, building capacity for long-term heritage preservation. Chinese economic reforms beginning in the 1980s created new opportunities for developing Western Chinese territories that included important historical Silk Road regions. The government's Western Development Strategy, launched in 2000, included substantial investments in transportation infrastructure, urban development, and tourism promotion that affected areas like Xinjiang, Gansu, and other provinces with significant Silk Road heritage. These development efforts often emphasized the historical importance of Silk Road connections, while pursuing modernization objectives that sometimes conflicted with heritage preservation priorities. The launch of China's Belt and Road Initiative in 2013 represented the most ambitious attempt to revive Silk Road connectivity since the medieval period. President Xi Jinping's announcement of the initiative during visits to Kazakhstan and Indonesia explicitly referenced historical Silk Road networks, while proposing modern infrastructure development projects that would connect Asia, Europe, and Africa through land and maritime routes. The initiative's scope, involving potential investments exceeding $1 trillion across more than 60 countries, demonstrated China's commitment to recreating the economic integration that had characterized historical Silk Road networks. The Belt and Road Initiative's land-based components include railway construction projects that follow routes similar to ancient Silk Road pathways, while utilizing modern technology to overcome geographical obstacles that had challenged historical travelers. The China-Europe Railway Express service, connecting Chinese manufacturing centers with European markets through Kazakhstan, Russia, and Belarus, enables cargo shipments to travel between China and Europe in approximately 2 weeks compared to the month or more required for maritime transportation. This service demonstrates how modern technology can revive the speed advantages that had made overland routes competitive with maritime alternatives during certain historical periods. Infrastructure development projects associated with the Belt and Road Initiative include port construction, highway development, and telecommunications networks that create modern equivalents of the caravanserais, roads, and communication systems that had supported historical Silk Road commerce. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, involving investments in transportation infrastructure, energy projects, and industrial development, exemplifies how contemporary connectivity projects can transform regional economic relationships while referencing historical precedents for cross-border cooperation and trade. The Belt and Road Initiative's emphasis on cultural exchange and people-to-people connections explicitly acknowledges the cultural dimensions of historical Silk Road networks while promoting contemporary educational exchanges, tourism development, and cultural preservation projects. Chinese universities have established Confucius Institutes in Central Asian countries, while cultural festivals and artistic exchanges celebrate shared heritage and promote mutual understanding. These cultural components of the initiative recognize that successful economic integration requires the kind of cross-cultural relationships that had characterized historical Silk Road civilizations. Contemporary archaeological research at Silk Road sites continues to reveal new information about ancient trade networks while utilizing advanced technologies that enable more sophisticated analysis of archaeological evidence. Ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, and other remote sensing technologies allow archaeologists to identify buried structures and survey large areas without destructive excavation. DNA analysis of ancient human remains provides information about population movements and cultural interactions, while chemical analysis of artifacts reveals details about trade relationships and manufacturing techniques. The application of digital technologies to Silk Road heritage preservation includes virtual reality reconstructions of ancient sites, online databases of archaeological findings, and digital archives of historical manuscripts. These technologies enable global audiences to experience Silk Road heritage without traveling to remote locations, while providing researchers with new tools for analyzing and interpreting historical evidence. The digitization of manuscript collections from sites like Dunhuang makes these materials accessible to scholars worldwide, while reducing handling of fragile original documents. International academic collaborations focused on Silk Road research bring together scholars from multiple countries to investigate questions that require expertise in diverse languages, cultures, and historical traditions. The Silk Road Studies program at various universities facilitates interdisciplinary research that combines archaeology, history, linguistics, art history, and other fields to develop comprehensive understanding of Silk Road civilizations. These collaborative approaches recognize that Silk Road history cannot be fully understood from any single national or cultural perspective. The influence of Silk Road cultural exchanges on contemporary art, cuisine, and cultural practices demonstrates the enduring legacy of ancient connectivity patterns. Fusion cuisine in major cities worldwide often combines ingredients and cooking techniques that originally spread along Silk Road networks, while contemporary artists draw inspiration from the multicultural artistic traditions that developed in ancient trading cities. Fashion designers incorporate textile patterns and decorative motifs that originated in Silk Road workshops, while musicians experiment with combinations of instruments and musical styles that echo the cultural synthesis that characterized medieval Central Asian cities. Modern tourism development in Central Asian countries increasingly emphasizes Silk Road heritage as a means of attracting international visitors and generating economic benefits for local communities. Tourism infrastructure projects include hotels, restaurants, and transportation services designed to accommodate visitors interested in experiencing Silk Road history and culture. These developments create economic opportunities for local populations while raising awareness of Central Asian cultural heritage among international audiences. The challenges facing contemporary Silk Road heritage preservation include urban development pressures, climate change impacts, and the need to balance conservation objectives with economic development needs. Rapid urbanization in Central Asian cities threatens archaeological sites through construction projects and infrastructure development, while climate change affects the preservation conditions at desert sites and mountain locations. International conservation organizations work with local authorities to develop preservation strategies that protect cultural heritage while accommodating legitimate development needs. Educational initiatives promoting Silk Road history and cultural heritage include curriculum development projects, teacher training programs, and educational materials designed for various age groups and cultural contexts. These programs aim to increase awareness of Silk Road heritage while promoting values of cultural tolerance, international cooperation, and peaceful exchange that characterize the best aspects of historical Silk Road civilizations. Educational exchanges enable students from different countries to learn about shared heritage while developing cross-cultural understanding and communication skills. The contemporary relevance of Silk Road history extends beyond academic interest and heritage preservation to include practical lessons for modern international relations and economic development. The success of historical Silk Road networks demonstrates the benefits of cultural openness, commercial cooperation, and peaceful exchange between different civilizations. These historical examples provide models for contemporary efforts to build international partnerships and address global challenges through collaborative approaches that respect cultural diversity while pursuing common objectives. Religious communities along former Silk Road routes continue to maintain traditions and practices that preserve elements of the religious diversity that characterized ancient trading cities. Buddhist monasteries in Central Asia, Islamic institutions throughout the region, and other religious organizations serve as repositories of cultural knowledge and spiritual practices that connect contemporary communities with their historical heritage. These religious institutions often play important roles in heritage preservation and cultural education, while adapting ancient traditions to modern circumstances. The enduring influence of Silk Road cultural exchanges on international relations reflects the networks of trust, mutual understanding, and cooperative relationships that developed through centuries of commercial and cultural interaction. Contemporary diplomatic relationships between countries along former Silk Road routes often reference shared historical experiences and cultural connections that facilitate communication and cooperation on modern issues. These historical relationships provide foundations for contemporary partnerships while demonstrating the long-term benefits of cultural exchange and peaceful interaction. As the world becomes increasingly interconnected through digital technologies and global economic systems, the Silk Road's legacy offers both inspiration and practical guidance for managing cultural diversity and international cooperation in the 21st century. The ancient trading networks that connected civilizations across Eurasia for over a millennium demonstrate humanity's capacity for peaceful exchange and mutual benefit across cultural boundaries. While modern connectivity operates through different technologies and institutional frameworks, the fundamental principles of mutual respect, commercial cooperation, and cultural exchange that sustained the Silk Road remain relevant for addressing contemporary global challenges and opportunities. The Silk Road's transformation from historical reality to modern symbol reflects its enduring significance as a model for international cooperation and cultural exchange. From its origins in Han Dynasty diplomatic missions to its contemporary revival through China's Belt and Road Initiative, the Silk Road continues to inspire efforts to connect diverse civilizations through peaceful commerce and cultural understanding. This remarkable continuity demonstrates that the vision of a connected, cooperative world that emerged from ancient trading relationships remains a powerful force for positive change in our interconnected global civilization.